Welcome. You do not need to do anything right now. You do not need to remember any of this. You do not need to take notes or stay awake or follow along carefully. This is a place to rest. This is 3 hours of very old, very quiet Australian history, told slowly, told gently, told the way you might hear it from someone sitting beside you on a long veranda in the late afternoon, while the light goes golden and the birds settle into the trees, and there is nothing at all that needs doing. Australia is old. It is one of the oldest inhabited places on Earth. The stories that have accumulated here, across tens of thousands of years of continuous human presence, across the colonial period, and the gold rushes and the slow building of cities in a landscape that did not particularly want cities, are deep and layered and strange in ways that mainstream history often does not get around to telling. Tonight, we are going to wander through some of the stranger corners of that history. We are going to visit forgotten places and lost towns and people whose names have mostly slipped out of the official record. We are going to move slowly through all of it. There is no hurry. The past is not going anywhere. If you fall asleep before we finish, that is exactly right. Let us begin. Number 1, the town that voted to disappear. In the dry interior of Queensland, about 400 kilometres west of Longreach, there was once a town called Kyabra. It had a post office, a school, a police station, a small general store, and at its peak in the 1890s, a population of several hundred people. The town existed because of the wool industry, the great stations of the Western Queensland Channel Country, those enormous properties that measured their land in millions of acres, and their sheep in hundreds of thousands, needed a service centre. Kyabra was that centre. The people of Kyabra built their town with the confidence of people who believed their place in the landscape was permanent. The school had a flagpole. The post office had a proper timber facade. The police station had a lockup made of stone, because stone suggests permanence, suggests that whoever built it expected to be there for a very long time. The wool industry did not sustain that confidence. The drought years of the late 1890s and early 1900s hit Western Queensland with a ferocity that broke the pastoral economy of the region. Stations that had been running hundreds of thousands of sheep reduced their flocks to fractions of those numbers. Some stations collapsed entirely. The people who worked on the stations moved on, and as they moved on, the need for a service centre diminished. Kyabra found itself serving a community that was no longer there in the numbers it had been. The school closed first, then the store, then the post office. The police station persisted for a while because someone had to maintain some kind of official presence. But eventually the constable was reassigned to Cunnamulla and the station closed as well. By 1920, Kyabra was not quite a ghost town, but it was heading in that direction. A few families remained, attached to the land and to the community by ties that were harder to break than economics. But the population had fallen to a handful of people, and the buildings were beginning to show the effects of abandonment. What makes Kyabra unusual in the long list of Australian towns that were built and then slowly emptied is what happened in 1924. The remaining residents held a meeting. They discussed their situation with a directness that was characteristic of people who had lived in harsh country for a long time, and had learned that sentiment and reality needed to be kept clearly separate. They concluded collectively that Kyabra was finished. Not failing, not struggling, but finished. The town had served its purpose. The purpose was gone. It was time to leave. They voted. The vote was unanimous. The town of Kyabra would be formally abandoned. The residents who remained would relocate, taking what they could, leaving what they could not move, and closing the chapter cleanly. This is unusual because most towns do not die by community decision. They die by attrition, by the slow departure of individuals and families, each leaving without formally acknowledging that a leaving is what they're doing, until the last person finds themselves alone in a place that used to be a town. The gradual death is the common death. Kyabra chose the deliberate death instead. There was something almost dignified in it, the residents of a dying town sitting together and deciding together that they were done, that the experiment was over, that they would go. They went. The buildings remained for a while. The stone lockup remained for quite a long time because stone resists the outback better than timber. Travellers passing through in the 1930s and 1940s recorded the ruins of the school, the post office facade, the police station. By the 1960s, most of what had been above ground was gone, weathered and fallen, and absorbed back into the red earth of Western Queensland. There is a location on old maps where Kyabra once was. The Mitchell grass country rolls over it now. The Channel country floods and drains and floods again in the wet years. The stone of the lockup may still be there, somewhere beneath the grass, waiting. But the town itself voted to go, and it went. Number 2. the lighthouse keeper who kept the log after everyone left. On a stretch of the Western Australian coastline that is now a marine park and wildlife reserve, there was a lighthouse built in 1903 to guide ships through a passage that had claimed several vessels in the years before. The lighthouse was staffed, as lighthouses were, by a keeper and an assistant keeper, men who lived at the station for months at a time, keeping the light burning, maintaining the fog signal, recording in a daily log the weather conditions, the ships that passed, the state of the equipment. The keeper appointed to this station in 1911 was a man named Frederick Alderton. He had been a lighthouse keeper for 11 years by the time he came to this particular posting, and he had the temperament that the work required, which is to say that he was comfortable with solitude and careful by habit, and found in the rhythm of maintenance a kind of satisfaction that more sociable work had never provided him. Alderton kept the log with extraordinary detail, not just the required entries about weather and shipping and equipment, but observations about the wildlife on the rocks below the lighthouse, the behavior of the sea in different wind conditions, the appearance of the night sky on clear nights, the sound of the station in different seasons. Reading his log is like reading the journal of a man who has decided that the small corner of the world he inhabits deserves to be documented fully, not because anyone will necessarily read it, but because documentation is a form of attention, and attention is a form of respect. His assistant keeper was posted elsewhere in 1914. The war had created staffing difficulties across the lighthouse service, and the station was deemed low enough in traffic volume to operate with a single keeper rather than two. Alderton did not complain. He was accustomed to solitude. He simply adjusted his maintenance schedule to account for the additional workload and continued keeping the log. The isolation deepened over the following years. Supply ships came less frequently. Communication with the mainland was limited to the wireless equipment at the station, which required regular maintenance to function reliably. Alderton maintained it. He maintained everything. The log records each small repair, each adjustment to the equipment, with the same careful detail he had applied to his wildlife observations. In 1921, the lighthouse service sent a relief keeper to the station for Alderton's annual leave. The relief keeper arrived to find the station in perfect condition. The equipment was functioning. The light had not missed a single night. The log was current to the day of arrival. Alderton left for his leave and returned 6 weeks later. The log resumes without interruption. What the log records across all of these years, what makes it unusual among the records of lighthouse stations from this period, is the cumulative effect of the daily entries. Taken individually, each entry is modest, a record of conditions and maintenance and the occasional observation about a passing ship or a pod of whales or the behavior of the osprey that nested on the rocks below. But taken together, across the years, the log becomes something else. It becomes a portrait of a particular stretch of coast, witnessed with sustained attention over a period of more than 2 decades. Alderton was replaced at the station in 1934, when the lighthouse service decided to automate the facility. He was 61 years old. He had been keeping the log at this station for 23 years. On his last entry, he noted the weather conditions, the state of the equipment, the ships that had passed, and then added a single additional line. The line was, "This station is well." He signed his name and closed the log. The log is in the State Records Office of Western Australia. It has been read by a handful of researchers and is occasionally mentioned in histories of the lighthouse service. Alderton himself returned to a town in the southwest of the state, where he had a brother and died in 1947. He did not write any further journals, as far as the record shows. Perhaps he had said everything he needed to say. Perhaps, without the station to observe, there was nothing that seemed worth writing down. Number 3. The river that changed its mind. Geography is usually thought of as fixed. Mountains do not relocate. Coastlines shift slowly over geological time. Rivers follow the paths cut by centuries of water movement and are generally considered to be, if not permanent, at least long-term in their commitments. The Cooper Creek in the Channel Country of southwestern Queensland did not read that memo. Cooper Creek is one of the great inland waterways of Australia, a river system that drains an enormous area of central Queensland and flows, when it flows, toward the great inland lakes of South Australia. When it flows is the key phrase. For much of the year and in many years entirely, Cooper Creek does not flow at all. It sits in a series of permanent waterholes connected by dry sandy channels, waiting for the rains that will fill it and send it moving westward. When the rains come, Cooper Creek becomes something extraordinary. The floods that move down the system can spread for hundreds of kilometers across flat country, turning the dry channel country into a shallow inland sea, filling Lake Eyre, or Kadithander as the Arabana people call it, with water that has traveled hundreds of kilometers from the catchment areas of Western Queensland. The river is famous in Australian history as the place where Burke and Wills made their fatal camp on the way back from their attempted crossing of the continent in 1861. But the Burke and Wills story is not what we are here to talk about tonight. We are here to talk about what happened to a stretch of Cooper Creek in the 1870s, when the river, with no apparent warning or explanation, changed course. The pastoral stations that had been established along the Cooper in the 1860s were built with reference to the water holes and the channels that existed at the time. Stockyards were placed near reliable water. Homesteads were positioned to take advantage of shade and drainage. Everything was built in relationship to where the water was. In the wet season of 1872, an exceptionally large flood moved down the Cooper system. By the standards of Cooper Creek floods, which can be spectacular, this was a major event. The water spread widely across the flat country and found new paths across the land. When the flood receded, one section of the Cooper had moved. The main channel had shifted several kilometers to the south, abandoning a stretch of the old channel bed that had been the reliable center of water supply for 3 stations. The water holes that the stations had depended on were still there, but they were now side pockets of the system, no longer connected to the main flow in the way they had been. In a drought year, they would dry up. The station managers reported this to their employers and to the colonial government with the particular combination of matter-of-factness and desperation that characterizes accounts of environmental disruption in the Queensland outback. The river had moved. This was a problem. What were they going to do about it? The answer, in the short term, was nothing. Rivers do not have to stay where people put them on maps. The stations adjusted as best they could, shifting their grazing patterns to follow the new water, sinking new bores where the old surface water was now unreliable. One station, whose name has been corrupted in successive transcriptions of the original records and is now essentially unreadable, was abandoned entirely. The homestead was left standing and the family moved downstream to a location on the new channel. What happened to the buildings is not recorded. In the outback, abandoned buildings become sources of materials. Someone almost certainly took the timber. The stone foundations, if there were stone foundations, may still be there. The shifted channel section is still visible from aerial photographs, a faint linear depression in the landscape slightly south of the current Cooper Creek, marking where the main flow used to be before it changed its mind in 1872. The river has not moved again since then, but in a landscape where water is everything and everything's organized around water, the memory of that movement, passed down through station histories and pastoral records, carries a particular weight. The land remembers where the water used to be. Number 4, the Tasmanian settlement that existed for 11 years and left almost no trace. In the early colonial period of Tasmania, then called Van Diemen's Land, the British government made several attempts to establish settlements in parts of the island that seemed promising for agricultural development, but turned out to be less promising than they initially appeared. One of these settlements was established on the west coast of Tasmania in 1826. The west coast of Tasmania is not gentle country. It is one of the most dramatically beautiful and relentlessly inhospitable landscapes in Australia, a region of mountains and rainforests and wild ocean coastline where the weather comes in from the Southern Ocean without having encountered any significant landmass between Antarctica and the Tasmanian coast. The rainfall is extraordinary. The wind is extraordinary. The terrain is difficult in ways that make difficult terrain elsewhere seem merely challenging by comparison. The settlement was established anyway, because the colonial government had heard reports of good timber in the area, and timber was a valuable resource. A party of convicts and overseers was sent to establish a base, cut timber, and begin the work of turning the forest into usable products. The settlement struggled from the beginning. The terrain made extraction of the timber almost impossibly difficult. The tools they had were adequate for forestry in England, but not for the hardwood forests of western Tasmania, where the trees were larger and harder and more deeply rooted than anything the overseers had previously encountered. The convict labor was uncooperative, which was understandable given that they were being asked to do brutal work in brutal conditions for no compensation beyond the minimal rations of the convict system. The settlement persisted despite these difficulties for 11 years, from 1826 to 1837, when it was finally abandoned as uneconomical. The timber that had been extracted was not sufficient to justify the expense of maintaining the settlement. The convicts were transferred to other locations. The overseers returned to Hobart. They left behind the buildings they had constructed, the tracks they had cut through the forest, the clearing they had made in the rainforest near the coast. And the forest took them back. This is the normal story of a failed settlement, and it would be unremarkable except for what happened when researchers tried to find evidence of the settlement in the 20th century. They could not find it. The forest had absorbed everything so completely that the physical evidence of 11 years of human occupation had essentially vanished. The tracks had grown over, the buildings had rotted and been covered by decades of fallen leaves and new growth. The clearing had re-established itself as forest. A survey conducted in the 1980s, using historical records to locate the probable site and then searching the area systematically, found only the faintest traces, a slightly different composition of the undergrowth in areas where the soil had been disturbed, a single corroded iron hinge half buried in leaf litter, a linear depression that might have been the edge of a building foundation or might have been a natural feature. 11 years of human occupation in one of the most inhospitable environments in Australia left almost no lasting mark on the landscape. This is a reminder of something that Australian history sometimes obscures, which is that the continent and its island are extraordinarily good at erasing human presence when the humans stop fighting the landscape. The settlement at Kyabra left ruins that persisted for decades in the dry Queensland outback. The settlement on the Tasmanian west coast left almost nothing in the wet rainforest. The landscape is the determining factor. Where the landscape is dry and still and the agents of decay are slow, things persist. Where the landscape is wet and active and the agents of decay are vigorous, things vanish. The 11 years of that settlement are recorded in colonial documents, in the accounts of convicts who served there and overseers who reported to Hobart, and the occasional visitor who came to inspect the operation. The documents are in the Tasmanian Archive and Heritage Office. The physical record on the ground is essentially nothing. 11 years, gone. Number 5. The man who mapped rivers that did not exist. John Arrowsmith was a London cartographer who published maps of Australia throughout the first half of the 19th century. His maps were important documents, used by explorers and settlers and the colonial governments that were trying to understand and administer a continent they had only partially explored. Some of his maps were accurate and extremely useful. Some of them contained features that explorers, when they reached the relevant areas, discovered were entirely fictional. This was not Arrowsmith's fault, or not entirely. He was working from reports sent back to England by explorers and surveyors who were themselves working under difficult conditions with limited equipment and limited time. When an explorer reported a river system in a given location, Arrowsmith drew a river system in that location. When the next explorer went to that location and found no river, the map was wrong. But the original report was also wrong, and the chain of error extended from the field to the cartographer's desk in London, without anyone being deliberately deceptive. The most interesting case of Arrowsmith's fictional geography is a series of rivers that appeared on his maps of the interior of the continent in the 1830s and 1840s. These rivers appeared to drain westward from a central high point in the continent, flowing toward the western coast. The idea of a central divide, with rivers running in all directions from it, was consistent with what European geographers expected to find in a continental interior. It was the model that worked in Europe and North America. There was no particular reason to expect Australia to be different. Australia was different. The interior of Australia does not have the kind of central divide that European geographical models predicted. It has the opposite, a vast low-lying basin, the Lake Eyre Basin, into which inland rivers drain and where the water sits in a shallow lake that is dry for most of the time. The rivers of the interior do not run to the coast. They run inward, toward the low point of the basin. The fictional rivers on Arrowsmith's maps were based on explorer reports that interpreted natural features, flat-topped hills, dry creek beds, mirages visible from a distance, as evidence of water systems that fitted the expected model. The explorers were not lying. They were pattern matching against a mental model of how continental geography should work, and the patterns they found seemed to confirm that model. When subsequent explorers reached the areas where the fictional rivers were marked and found dry country instead, the frustration was considerable. The Mitchell who followed the rivers that Mitchell had reported and found nothing as a recurring type in the exploration accounts of interior Australia. Arrowsmith's maps were corrected edition by edition as the actual geography of the continent became clearer. But for a period of perhaps 30 years, significant portions of the Australian interior were mapped with rivers and lakes and watercourses that had never existed. Pastoral stations were planned in locations selected partly because Arrowsmith's map showed reliable water nearby. Some of those stations survived because the map was wrong in favorable ways. The country was drier than expected, but the settlers found water elsewhere. Some of them did not survive. The fictional rivers are gone from modern maps, but they are preserved in the historical editions, cartographic ghosts of a European geographical imagination applied to a continent that had no interest in conforming to European models. Number 6. The Aboriginal trade route that ran for 2,000 kilometers. One of the things that colonial Australia consistently failed to understand about the continent it was occupying was the degree to which the landscape had been organized, managed, and traversed by the people who had been living on it for 60,000 years. The colonial imagination produced an image of pre-contact Australia as an empty wilderness, an unmanaged landscape inhabited by small, isolated groups of people who moved randomly across the land without purpose or organization. This image was wrong in almost every particular. The landscape was managed through controlled burning and selective harvesting, and the careful maintenance of water sources and food plants. The groups were not isolated, but were connected through extensive trade and ceremonial networks. The movement was not random, but was organized along routes that were thousands of years old, following water and resources and the obligations of ceremony. One of the most significant of these routes ran from the Gulf of Carpentaria in the north of Queensland south and west through the interior, crossing what is now Central Australia, eventually reaching the coast of South Australia and the trading networks of the southern peoples. The total length of this route, following its various branches and connections, was approximately 2,000 kilometers. The route was a trade route in the most direct sense. Materials and objects moved along it in both directions. The paturi, a native plant with stimulant properties that grew in specific locations in Western Queensland, was carried along the route to peoples far to the south who could not grow it themselves. Stone for toolmaking, sourced from quarries at specific locations, traveled along the route. Ceremonial objects moved along it, passing from group to group in exchange relationships that were governed by careful protocols. The route also carried people. Initiated men traveling for ceremony, messengers carrying news, young people making the journeys that were part of their education in the geography and the relationships of their world. The route was not a highway in any colonial sense. It was a living connection between communities, maintained by use and by the relationships that use created. Colonial explorers followed sections of the route without fully understanding what they were on. The routes often led to water because the Aboriginal track networks had been organized around reliable water sources over thousands of years of trial and experience, and water is what explorers needed. Several explorers noted in their journals that they were following what appeared to be a well-used native path without recognizing that the path was part of a continental-scale network. The route is documented in ethnographic records compiled in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when anthropologists began recording the knowledge of Aboriginal people who still knew the route and its connections. It is documented in the accounts of explorers who traveled along sections of it. It is documented in the distribution patterns of paturi and other traded objects in archaeological sites across the interior. What it is not is a feature of the mainstream historical account of Australia. The colonial narrative of the continent does not have much space for a 2,000-kilometer Aboriginal trade route. The story of exploration and settlement is told as if the explorers were moving through empty country, finding their way through virgin wilderness by their own efforts and ingenuity. The trade routes and the water sources and the knowledge systems that made that country traversable are mostly absent from the story. They were not absent from the country. Number 7. The Hotel at the End of the World. In 1912, a man named Harold Donahue built a hotel at a location in the far northwest of Western Australia that could only be reached by a journey of several days by camel from the nearest town of any size. The location was not on any established route. It was not near any known resource that would attract a regular flow of travelers. It was in country that was considered, by the standards of the time and the subsequent century, to be extremely remote even by Australian outback standards. Why Harold Donahue built a hotel there is a question that has occupied a small number of historians who have encountered his story in the records of the Western Australian licensing authorities. The hotel was licensed in 1912. The licensing authority, which was required to inspect licensed premises at reasonable intervals, sent an inspector in 1914 who reported that the hotel was a substantial structure of corrugated iron and timber, that it had a bar, 2 bedrooms, and a dining room, and that it was, at the time of inspection, operating. The inspector noted that there were 3 guests at the hotel at the time of his visit. He did not speculate about where these guests had come from or where they were going. He noted that the bar was stocked with whiskey and beer, that the dining room offered meals that were simple but adequate, and that the premises were clean. He recommended renewal of the license. The license was renewed. Inspections continued at intervals. The reports consistently noted that the hotel was operating, that there were guests, and that the premises were maintained. Harold Donahue died in 1924. His widow, a woman named Mabel, continued to operate the hotel. A 1926 inspection noted that the hotel was still operating under Mabel Donahue's management, that the bar had been expanded slightly, and that there were 4 guests at the time of inspection. The last inspection report in the licensing records is from 1931. The inspector noted that the premises appeared to be unoccupied. The bar stock was still in place. The bedrooms were made up. The dining room was set, but there was no one there. The hotel is not mentioned in subsequent records. Whether Mabel Donahue left deliberately or died on the premises and was found and removed by persons who did not file a report, or whether something else happened, is not recorded. The building stood for many years after the last inspection. Travelers in the area mentioned it occasionally in the 1940s and 1950s, noting the abandoned hotel as a landmark in a landscape without many landmarks. By the 1970s, reports suggest it had partially collapsed. Who the guests were, what brought them to a hotel at the end of the world, what business they had in country that remote, is not recorded anywhere that researchers have been able to find. The licensing records note their existence, but do not name them or describe them or explain their presence. 3 guests in 1914, 4 guests in 1926, at the end of the world, staying at the hotel that Harold Donahue built for reasons that no one has been able to determine. Number 8, the language that survived on one island. When European settlement came to the southeastern corner of Australia in 1788, the coastal regions of what is now New South Wales and Victoria were inhabited by many distinct Aboriginal language groups, each with its own language, its own territory, and its own complex relationship to the land and to the adjacent groups. Within a few decades of settlement, many of these language groups had been devastated by disease, displacement, and violence. Populations that had been stable for thousands of years collapsed in a period of years. Languages that had been spoken by thousands of people were reduced to a handful of speakers, and then to none. The speed of this collapse was such that many languages were not documented before they died. Missionaries and anthropologists who arrived in the mid-19th century found themselves trying to record the remnants of linguistic traditions that were already severely diminished. In many cases, the last speaker of a language died before anyone had recorded more than a few words. One language survived this process in a more intact form than most, and the reason it survived was geography. Yorta Yorta, the language of the people of the Murray-Goulburn River Junction in what is now northern Victoria, survived partly because the Yorta Yorta people were able to maintain a community presence in their country across the colonial period in ways that many other groups could not. They were not entirely removed from their land. A mission established at Kumaragunja in the 1880s, while it brought its own disruptions and impositions, also provided a location where the community could maintain some coherence. But there is another element of the Yorta Yorta survival story that involves an island. In the Murray River, near the confluence with the Goulburn, there were several islands whose status under colonial land law was ambiguous enough that pastoral and agricultural encroachment was slower there than on the surrounding mainland. Yorta Yorta people used these islands as refuges, places where community life could continue with somewhat less disruption than on the mainland territories. On one of these islands, in the late 19th century, a group of Yorta Yorta elders made a deliberate decision to maintain the teaching of the language to children, in a context where the colonial authorities were actively discouraging the use of Aboriginal languages, and where the pressure to assimilate was enormous. This decision, made quietly and maintained across subsequent generations, contributed to the survival of Yorta Yorta as a living language. It was not preserved in documents alone, which is how most seriously endangered languages survive, if they survive at all. It was kept as a spoken language in the mouths of people who had been taught it, by people who had been taught it by people who remembered it as the first language of their childhood. Yorta Yorta is not a flourishing language. The number of fluent speakers has been small and has fluctuated, and the work of language revival has been ongoing and sometimes difficult, but it has never reached the point of having no speakers at all, which is the point from which recovery is impossible. The island in the Murray, where elders sat with children in the late 19th century and spoke the language that the colonial world was trying to silence, is not marked on any map with its significance noted. It is a river island in the Murray system, unremarkable from the outside, important in ways that are not visible to anyone who does not know the story. The language that was kept there is still spoken, quietly, partially, imperfectly, but spoken, still in the world. Number 9, the expedition that went south and did not come back for 3 years. In 1911, the Australian Antarctic expedition, led by Douglas Mawson, departed Hobart for the Antarctic coast. This is not, in itself, a lost or forgotten piece of history. Mawson is a well-documented figure in Australian exploration history, and the expedition he led has been written about extensively. What is less well known is what happened to a small party that Mawson left at a secondary base on the coast of Antarctica, while the main expedition conducted its work from the primary base further east. The secondary base was established at the Shackleton Ice Shelf, and the party stationed there consisted of 5 men under the leadership of a geologist named Frank Wild. Wild and his men were to conduct observations and explorations from their coastal base while maintaining communication with Mawson's main party. Communication proved difficult. The wireless equipment was unreliable, and the distances involved were such that sustained contact was not possible. Wild's party conducted their work in substantial isolation, spending the winter of 1912 at their base on the ice shelf, waiting for the summer to permit continued exploration, and for the ship to return and collect them. The ship came the following summer and collected the party. They returned to Australia having been away for more than a year, having conducted their observations and their explorations, and having survived the Antarctic winter with all members of the party intact. The records Wild's party kept during their time at the secondary base have not received the same attention as Mawson's own records. The published account of the expedition focused on the main party and on Mawson's own extraordinary solo survival journey across the Antarctic plateau. Wild's base and Wild's party appear in the account, but as a supporting element rather than as subjects in their own right. The observations Wild's party made from the Shackleton Ice Shelf, the careful records of the ice conditions and the wildlife and the geology of that section of the Antarctic coast, are in the archives of the Mawson's Hutts Foundation and the Australian Antarctic Division. They have been used by scientists studying the historical state of the Antarctic ice sheet and by historians writing about the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. But they have not been the subject of a popular account in the way that Mawson's own journey has been. Frank Wild is remembered by those who know Antarctic history as one of the most important figures in the heroic age, a man who participated in multiple Antarctic expeditions over a period of more than 20 years, and who contributed enormously to the exploration and documentation of the continent. His secondary base on the Shackleton Ice Shelf is one small piece of that contribution. The ice shelf itself has changed significantly since 1912. Ice moves in calves and shifts over decades, and the landscape Wild's party navigated is not the landscape that exists today. The base they built is gone, as all temporary Antarctic structures eventually go. What remains is the record, the observations, the measurements, the notes made by 5 men spending an Antarctic winter in almost complete isolation, doing their work carefully and completely because that was what the work required. The record remains. Number 10. The orchardist who planted trees in the desert. Somewhere in the far northwest of South Australia, in country that the pastoral industry had largely abandoned as too dry for sustained grazing, there was in the 1890s a man who planted fruit trees. His name was Theodor Kirschenbaum. He had come to Australia from a part of Germany where fruit growing was a significant part of the agricultural economy, and he brought with him both the technical knowledge of horticulture and the conviction, which his adopted landscape would test severely, that things could be made to grow if you attended to them carefully enough. Kirschenbaum selected his location, not randomly, but with attention to the local hydrology, following the advice of an Aboriginal man whose name is recorded only as Billy in the historical accounts, who knew the water patterns of the country and who identified a location where subsurface water came close enough to the surface to be accessible by tree roots during the dry season. He planted his trees there. He planted peaches and apricots and a variety of fig that he had brought from Germany as cuttings wrapped in damp cloth, surviving the long sea voyage in a state of suspended vitality. He dug channels to direct the seasonal floodwater from a nearby creek across his planting, charging the soil with moisture that would sustain the trees through the long dry months. The trees grew. This is remarkable in itself. The conditions Kirschenbaum was working with were not conditions under which European fruit trees had any established track record of success. The heat was extreme by European standards. The rainfall was minimal and completely seasonal. The soil was shallow and low in the organic matter that fruit trees prefer. But the trees grew. Within a decade of planting, Kirschenbaum had a small but productive orchard in country that everyone else had concluded was suited only for minimal pastoral use at best and abandonment at worst. He sold fruit to the occasional traveler who passed through. He dried much of the crop and sent it to a merchant in Port Augusta. He lived in a stone house he had built beside the orchard, a house with thick walls to moderate the extreme temperature, and a design that oriented the main rooms to catch the prevailing breeze. Kirschenbaum died in 1921. He had no children. He left the property to a nephew in Germany who had no interest in traveling to Australia to take possession of an orchard in the South Australian desert. The orchard was not maintained. The irrigation channels fell into disrepair. The seasonal flooding that Kirschenbaum had directed across the planting was no longer channeled, and the trees were left to manage on their own. Some of them survived. The figs in particular were robust enough to persist without irrigation, their roots having reached down to the subsurface water that Billy had identified. As recently as the 1970s, travelers in the area reported finding a small stand of old fig trees producing fruit in country that had no other agriculture for hundreds of kilometers. Whether the trees are still there is uncertain. The area has been surveyed periodically for mineral exploration, and some of those surveys have noted the fig trees as an anomalous feature. The most recent reference in the available records is from a mineral exploration report filed in 1994, which noted the presence of what appeared to be old cultivated fig trees in a creek bed, apparently self-sustaining, apparently producing fruit. Theodore Kirschenbaum's trees, planted by a German orchardist with the guidance of an Aboriginal man named Billy, growing fruit in the South Australian desert for more than a century after the man who planted them was gone. That is a small and quiet persistence. It seems worth noting. Number 11. The post office that received letters for 40 years after it closed. In a small town in the New England tablelands of New South Wales, a post office was established in 1882 to serve the farming community of the district. The post office operated as such things do, receiving and distributing mail, selling stamps, providing the administrative services that kept people connected to the broader world. In 1921, the post office was formally closed. The volume of mail did not justify the expense of maintaining a staffed facility. The nearest post office, 12 kilometers away, would serve the district. The building that had housed the post office was sold. It became a residence, occupied by a series of families over the following decades. The building was unremarkable, a timber structure of the kind that was built throughout rural New South Wales in the colonial period, functional rather than beautiful, maintained because it was useful. But the postal authorities did not update their records immediately after the closure. This was not unusual. The administrative machinery of government in 1921 moved at a pace that would be recognized as leisurely by modern standards. Corrections to records happened when someone noticed an error or when a formal review was conducted. The postal records were not reviewed. Mail continued to be delivered to the address of the former post office. Not official mail, which was rerouted to the new facility, but private mail, addressed to residents who had used the old post office address as their mailing address and had not notified their correspondents of the change. The families who lived in the building after 1921 accepted the mail and tried to forward it to the intended recipients, or left it in a box by the door, or in some cases opened it when the intended recipient was clearly no longer in the district. Over the following decades, as the original residents who had used the address died or moved away, the mail continued to arrive. Christmas cards addressed to people who had been dead for 20 years, business correspondence for companies that had ceased to operate in the 1930s, personal letters for names that meant nothing to the current occupants. The families who lived in the building developed a custom of collecting the misdirected mail and taking it to the actual post office periodically, where a series of postmasters dealt with it as best they could, returning to sender where possible, filing in a dead letterbox where return was not possible, occasionally locating the intended recipient or their descendants and making a delivery that was decades overdue. A researcher looking into the history of the New England Tablelands postal network in the 1970s encountered the file of dead letters that had accumulated from this address over the preceding 50 years. The file was substantial. It contained correspondence that spanned 50 years of community life, an accidental archive of the social and commercial relationships of a rural district, preserved because a building's address had outlived the function that made the address significant. The building was demolished in 1975 to make way for a road widening project. The dead letter file was transferred to the regional postal archive, where it presumably remains, an accidental record of connections that persisted long after the people who made them were gone. Number 12. The mountain that kept being climbed first. Mount Kosciuszko is the highest point on the Australian continent, standing at 2,028 meters above sea level. It is located in the snowy mountains of New South Wales and is named for the Polish general Tadeusz Kościuszko, after whom the Polish explorer Paweł Edmund Strzelecki named the peak when he climbed it in 1840. Strzelecki's first ascent is the documented first ascent of the mountain. It is in the historical record. It is taught in Australian schools as a significant moment in the exploration of the continent. The problem is that Strzelecki climbed the wrong mountain. This is a well-known fact in the geography of the Snowy Mountains, and it has been a source of mild embarrassment for the official historical record since it was first pointed out in the early 20th century. Strzelecki climbed a peak that is actually slightly lower than the peak now called Kosciuszko. The true highest point on the continent is a different summit a short distance away. The name Kosciuszko was applied to the correct peak at some point in the decades following Strzelecki's climb, and the confusion between the two summits was sorted out gradually as better surveying equipment allowed more accurate altitude measurements. The peak that Strzelecki actually climbed is now called Mount Townsend, which is the second highest peak on the continent. So, who climbed the actual Kosciuszko first? The historical record is not entirely clear. The most likely candidates are surveyors working in the area in the 1840s and 1850s, who were making altitude measurements across the region and would have climbed the highest available summits as a practical necessity of their work. But their ascents were professional activities, not the kind of dramatic exploratory first that gets celebrated in historical accounts, and they did not receive the same commemorative attention as Strzelecki's climb. The situation is further complicated by the near certainty that Ngarigo people, the Aboriginal inhabitants of the Snowy Mountains, had been going up and onto the high country for thousands of years before European arrival. The high country was not visited for recreation. It was visited seasonally for the bogong moth harvest, one of the great seasonal food events of the southeastern highlands. The bogong moths, which were a rich source of protein and fat, came to the high granite country in enormous numbers each summer, and people came from hundreds of kilometers away to harvest them. Whether anyone specifically climbed to the summit of the highest peak during these seasonal visits is not documented in the ethnographic record, but people were on the high country, regularly and in numbers, for thousands of years before Strzelecki arrived and climbed the wrong mountain. The bogong moth harvest has declined dramatically in recent decades due to changes in agricultural practices in the lowland areas where the moths breed. A food event that sustained human communities in the southeastern highlands for thousands of years is now significantly diminished. The people who participated in it have memories that extend across generations, but the harvest itself is not what it was. The mountain stands, renamed correctly, at 2,028 meters. It has been climbed many times by many people since Strzelecki's misdirected first ascent. It is a popular destination for bushwalkers. There is a chairlift. The Ngarigo people were there first, and for much longer than anyone else, and they were there for reasons that had more to do with food and ceremony and the rhythms of a sustainable life than with the competitive first ascent culture of European exploration. Number 13, the shipwreck that became a farm. On the coast of Western Australia, in a region called the Abrolhos Islands, a ship called the Batavia wrecked in 1629. The Batavia was a Dutch East India Company vessel carrying passengers, crew, and a cargo of silver coins and other valuables from Amsterdam to Batavia, the colonial capital of the Dutch East Indies. The wreck itself was an event of considerable historical drama, involving a mutiny, a massacre, a rescue, and a trial that has been the subject of multiple books and documentaries. We will not go through all of that tonight, because the drama is not really what we are here for. What we are here for is what happened to the wreck after the drama was over. The Batavia sank on a reef off the coast of what is now Western Australia. The survivors, after the resolution of the mutiny and massacre, were eventually rescued and taken to Batavia. The ship remained on the reef, its cargo sinking into the sand and the coral as the hull broke up over the following years and decades. The silver coins, thousands of them, scattered across the reef and the seafloor. Some were recovered by the Dutch in the years following the wreck. Most were not. They remained on the seafloor, covered by sand and coral growth and the accumulation of centuries, waiting. In 1963, recreational divers exploring the Abrolhos Islands found the wreck site and began recovering artifacts. The discovery led to an official archaeological excavation that produced one of the most important collections of 17th century Dutch material culture ever found. The silver coins, the pewter plates, the navigational instruments, the personal belongings of the passengers and crew, all of it preserved in the clear cold water of the Indian Ocean. But the thing that the wreck became in the centuries between its sinking and its rediscovery is the thing that interests us tonight. The islands of the Abrolhos have been used for crayfishing since the colonial period, and the fishermen who worked the islands built small seasonal huts on them, living there during the fishing season and returning to the mainland afterward. The island nearest the wreck site was used by these fishermen as a base, and over the years they incorporated materials from the reef into their constructions and their daily lives without necessarily knowing what those materials were. A stone anchor from the Batavia ended up as a doorstop in a fisherman's hut. Silver coins recovered incidentally while diving for crayfish were used as currency in Fremantle, where their 17th century design attracted curiosity but not systematic attention. Ballast stone from the wreck, the heavy stones used to stabilize the ship, ended up incorporated into the walls of structures on the island. The wreck was a farm for salvage, worked informally and unsystematically by people who did not fully understand what they were working. The dramatic history of the Batavia's last voyage, the mutiny and massacre and rescue, was not known to the fishermen who used its remnants. To them, it was just old stuff from a reef, useful if it was useful and interesting if it was interesting, and otherwise simply part of the landscape of the islands. The formal archaeological excavation changed that relationship. What had been informal salvage became a protected site. The artifacts that had been scattered through the informal economy of the islands were documented and collected and placed in a museum in Geraldton, where they now tell the official story of the Batavia. The unofficial story, the story of the wrecker's farm, as informal resource, as source of doorstops and wallstones and old coins, is less neatly documented, but it is part of the history of the site. The 3 centuries between the wreck and the rediscovery, during which the Batavia was not a preserved historical monument, but a practical resource for the people who live nearby. Number 14. The woman who ran a farm alone for 23 years. In the records of a pastoral property in the Flinders Ranges of South Australia, there is a gap in the male ownership history that is explained, when you look carefully at the documentary record, by the presence of a woman who ran the property in its entirety for more than 2 decades. Her name was Katherine Brennan. She had come to the Flinders Ranges with her husband Patrick in 1878, when the land had been taken up for grazing and the infrastructure of a working station was being built. The Brennans were Irish, part of the substantial Irish Catholic immigration to South Australia that provided much of the labour and many of the small landholders of the colonial pastoral industry. Patrick Brennan died in 881, 3 years after they arrived. He was killed in a fall from a horse, a common enough cause of death in a culture organised around horses, leaving Katherine with a property that was only partially developed, a debt to the bank that held the mortgage, and 2 children aged 4 and 6. The conventional expectation was that Katherine would sell the property, pay off what debts she could, and move to Adelaide or one of the regional towns where there were support networks for a widow with young children. This is what most women in her situation did, because a pastoral property in the Flinders Ranges in 881 was not a thing you ran by yourself. Katherine Brennan did not do the conventional thing. She hired a stockman, a man from the district whose name appears in the records as Thomas Mulhall, and she ran the property herself. She made the decisions about when to sell stock and when to hold, about what improvements to make and when, about how to manage the relationship with the bank that held the mortgage. She kept the accounts. She negotiated with buyers and with the neighbouring station operators. She dealt with the droughts and the good seasons and the losses of stock to disease and the losses of fences to flood with the same matter-of-fact competence that her husband had brought to these problems before her. The records show a property that was maintained and slowly improved across the 1880s and 1890s. The debt to the bank was paid down and eventually eliminated. Small additions were made to the infrastructure. The fencing was maintained and extended. The stock numbers remained stable through the difficult years of the early 1890s, when many Flinders Ranges stations went under, because Katherine Brennan was managing conservatively, not overextending in the good years, not catastrophizing in the bad ones. Her children grew up. Her son took over the management of the property in 1904, when Katherine was in her mid-50s and had been running the station for 23 years. The records of Katherine Brennan's management of the property are in the pastoral records of the South Australian State Archive. They are accurate accounts, careful accounts, accounts that show a capable person doing complicated work over a long period of time. They are not dramatic. They are not the records of someone who overcame extreme adversity through heroic effort. They are the records of someone who did what needed to be done, season after season, without fanfare or acknowledgement. She's not a name in Australian history. She should be a name in Australian history. She ran a pastoral station alone for 23 years and handed it to her son, debt-free. That seems worth knowing. Number 15. The island that had two names and two histories. In Bass Strait, the body of water that separates the Australian mainland from Tasmania, there are islands. The Furno group, as it is collectively known, is a scattering of islands of various sizes that have been inhabited and abandoned and re-inhabited over the course of Australian history in ways that make their story more complex than their modest size might suggest. One of the smaller islands in the group has had, at various times, two quite distinct identities. To the sealers who worked the Bass Strait in the early 19th century, it was known by one name, a rough and practical designation that referred to a physical feature of the island. To the Aboriginal women from Tasmania and the mainland who were brought to the islands by the sealers, often against their will, and who built communities there across the early decades of the 19th century, it had a different name, a name in the Palawakani language that referred to something about the island that only became visible when you'd lived there for a while. The sealer's name is on the maps, the Aboriginal name is not. The story of the Bass Strait Islands in the early 19th century is one of the most complex and morally difficult stories in Australian history. The sealers who worked the strait, many of them men from Britain, America, and various Pacific ports, established themselves on the islands as a semi-permanent population. They needed labor. They obtained Aboriginal women through capture, through trade with Aboriginal communities on the mainland, through arrangements whose exact nature varied and whose consensual character was deeply questionable. These women brought to the islands knowledge and skills that the sealers did not have. They were expert in ocean water conditions. They knew how to read weather in ways that the sealers, with their European maritime training, did not. They managed the subsistence economy of the islands, gathering and preparing food from the sea and the land in ways that kept small island communities fed across seasons when the sealing industry provided limited income. Communities developed, children were born. A distinctive culture emerged on the islands, neither European nor Aboriginal, in the way that either of those categories was understood on the mainland, but something that had grown from the particular circumstances of island life in the Strait. The British colonial authorities on both sides of the strait disapproved of these communities in ways that were characteristic of the colonial period. The removal of Aboriginal women from their mainland communities was illegal in theory and tolerated in practice. The communities on the islands were not regulated. The children born there had an uncertain legal status. Eventually, in the 1830s, the colonial government organized the removal of the remaining Aboriginal Tasmanians to Flinders Island, the largest island in the group, as part of a policy that was presented as protective but functioned as a form of concentration that contributed to the further decline of the Tasmanian Aboriginal population. The women and their families on the smaller islands were caught between these processes. Some were moved, some remained. The communities they had built persisted in various forms. The descendants of those island communities are still in Tasmania and on the Bass Strait Islands. They maintain a claim to continuous Aboriginal identity that has been disputed and is now more widely recognized. The culture that emerged on the islands in the early 19th century, that mix of Aboriginal knowledge and practice with the maritime culture of the sealers, is part of their heritage. The island with two names still has one of those names on the map, and the other one in the memory of the people whose grandmothers named it. Number 16. The riverboat captain who never used maps. On the Murray-Darling River system, that vast network of waterways that drains the southeastern interior of Australia, the paddle steamer era of the mid to late 19th century was a period of extraordinary commercial activity. The rivers were the highways of the interior before the railways came, and the paddle steamers that worked them were essential links between the pastoral stations and the agricultural properties of the interior and the ports of the river mouths from which the produce was shipped to markets. The captains who worked the Murray-Darling system needed to know the rivers intimately. The channels were shallow and shifting, changing from season to season and from year to year as floods and droughts moved the sandbars and the snags. Charts of the river were made and quickly outdated. The knowledge that a captain needed was not the kind of knowledge that could be put on a piece of paper and kept current. It was the kind of knowledge that had to be lived. A captain named Edwin Dunning, who worked the Murray from the 1870s to the 1900s, was known among the river trade for operating without charts of any kind. He navigated the river by direct observation and by the accumulated knowledge in his head, knowledge built from 3 decades of continuous work on the river and from the stories of other captains who had worked it before him. Dunning could read the surface of the water in ways that told him where the channel ran and where the shallows were and where the snags lay hidden below the surface. The color of the water, the pattern of ripples, the way the current moved in particular conditions, all of it carried information that he had learned to read as directly as a sentence on a page. He carried his passengers and his cargo across 30 years of river work without a serious grounding, in a river that regularly grounded boats whose captains relied on charts and soundings and the conventional tools of river navigation. His knowledge of the river was not written down. It existed in his practice, in the decisions he made moment by moment as he moved the steamer through the channel. Other captains learned from working alongside him, from watching his decisions, and trying to understand the reasoning behind them. But the full body of knowledge was not transferable in any direct way. It existed in Dunning and in the river, in the relationship between a particular man and a particular body of water. And when Dunning retired in 1903 and moved to Adelaide, that relationship was over. The Murray continued to shift and change. The charts that other captains used continued to be made and to become outdated. The knowledge that Dunning had was the kind of knowledge that the river itself carried, in the movements of its water and the positions of its snags, available to anyone willing to pay the kind of sustained attention that Dunning had paid across 3 decades. Dunning died in Adelaide in 1909. He had been away from the river for 6 years. Whether he missed it, whether he went to bed at night and felt the slight adjustments of balance that a riverboat requires, the small constant compensations for the current and the wind, is not recorded. Some knowledge is entirely private. Some of the most important knowledge there is leaves no trace except in the world it helped to navigate. Number 17, the wool clip that was never delivered. In the records of the Queensland wool industry in the late 19th century, there are occasional references to a shipment of wool that was prepared for transport at a station in the Western Channel country and never arrived at the railhead. The clip in question was from a station that had been through a difficult but ultimately successful season. The drought that had affected much of Western Queensland in the early 1890s had been followed by a reasonable wet season, and the station's flock, depleted from the drought years, had produced enough wool to make a significant clip. The wool was baled, pressed, and loaded onto drays for the journey to the nearest railhead, which was several days' travel to the east. The drays left the station with a crew of 3 men and enough supplies for the journey. The station records show the departure date and the expected arrival date at the railhead. The wool never arrived. A search was organized when the drays failed to reach the railhead. The search party followed the route the drays would have taken, which was a well-established track across the Mitchell grass country. They found the drays, abandoned in a dry creek bed, still loaded with the baled wool. They found evidence of the camp that the crew had made nearby. They found personal effects belonging to the 3 men. They did not find the men. The official investigation found no evidence of violence. The drays were intact. The wool was undamaged. The camp had been left in an orderly way, not as if something had happened suddenly, but as if the men had simply walked away from it. 3 men, 4 days from the railhead. They walked away from the drays and the wool and did not come back. The most probable explanation, in the absence of any evidence of specific cause, is that the men became disoriented and lost, possibly in a dust storm or fog, and died in the Channel country without being found by the search party. This happens in Western Queensland. People step off the track, and the country takes them. But the lack of any physical evidence of their deaths, combined with the orderly state of the camp, led to speculation at the time about other possibilities. The men had absconded. The men had encountered something. The men had chosen to disappear. None of these alternatives was ever supported by evidence. The most parsimonious explanation is the one about disorientation and death in the outback. But the wool, sitting in its bales in the dry creek bed, waiting to be delivered to a market it never reached, became a small local legend in the Western Queensland pastoral community. The wool was eventually recovered and transported to the railhead by a party sent from the station. It arrived weeks late. The market had moved. The clip sold for less than it would have if it had arrived on time. The 3 men were never found. Number 18, the botanist who named things wrong on purpose. Ferdinand von Mueller was the government botanist of Victoria from 1853 to 1896, one of the longest tenures of any scientist in any government position in Australian history. He was a German-born botanist of extraordinary productivity who named and described thousands of Australian plant species during his career and built the herbarium of the Royal Botanic Gardens, Melbourne, into one of the great botanical collections of the Southern Hemisphere. He was also, it became apparent to later researchers, occasionally in the habit of naming plant species in ways that embedded personal messages or political commentary in the Latin names, which are the formal names of botanical taxonomy. This is not as unusual as it might seem. Botanical naming has always had a personal dimension. Species are often named for the botanist who discovered them, or for a patron, or for a colleague who contributed to the work. Names are small acts of commemoration, and sometimes of acknowledgement or even apology. Mueller used names in ways that were more pointed than the conventions of botanical naming usually allowed. Several of the names he assigned to species during periods of personal or professional difficulty encode, in the Latin terminology of taxonomy, commentary about his situation that would have been visible to anyone with sufficient classical knowledge and sufficient knowledge of his circumstances. A species named during a period when Mueller had been publicly criticized by a colleague received a Latin epithet that translates roughly as the persistent, a small act of defiance embedded in the scientific nomenclature. A species discovered at a location where Mueller had had a productive field excursion with a junior colleague received a name that translates roughly as the faithful companion, a kind of quiet commemoration. Whether these names were intentional messages, or whether they are the product of subsequent researchers looking for patterns in material that does not contain them, is genuinely uncertain. Mueller kept no personal diary that explains his naming choices. His letters, of which there are thousands, occasionally mention particular namings, but do not explain the possible embedded messages. What is not uncertain is that Mueller named nearly 12,000 plant species during his career, and that the names he chose reveal a personality that was engaged not just with the technical work of botanical taxonomy, but with the personal and political dimensions of his professional life. He is a strange and somewhat melancholy figure in the history of Australian science, a man of extraordinary productivity, who never fully achieved the recognition he believed his work deserved, who spent much of his later career in conflict with the administration of the Botanic Gardens, and who died in 1896 having given the better part of his life to documenting the plants of a continent that was not the one he had been born in. The plants he named are still out there, in the Australian landscape and in herbaria around the world, carrying the names he chose for them. The messages, if they are messages, persist in the nomenclature, available to anyone who knows Latin well enough to read them. Number 19. The school that taught in 4 languages. In the goldfields of Victoria in the 1850s, the rapid immigration of people from across the world created communities of extraordinary linguistic diversity. The gold rushes brought people from Britain, Ireland, China, the German states, California, Chile, and dozens of other places, and they arrived faster than any infrastructure for managing that diversity could be created. A school established near the Ballarat goldfields in 1855 found itself serving a community in which English was spoken by perhaps half the children who attended. The other half spoke some combination of Chinese, German, Italian, and various other languages, depending on which wave of immigration had most recently arrived in the district. The teacher was a man named James Whitmore, who had come from England with a teaching qualification and a decent classical education that included Latin and Greek, but none of the languages actually spoken by the children in his school. What Whitmore did, in the absence of any guidance from educational authorities who had not anticipated the situation, was recruit help from within the community. He engaged a Chinese shopkeeper who spoke some English to assist with translation for the Chinese children. He found a German miner who had been a school teacher in Württemberg before emigrating, and hired him to teach the German-speaking children in the afternoons. He learned enough Italian from an Italian woman in the community to manage basic communication with the Italian children, and she came to the school 2 mornings a week to help. The school, in practice, operated in 4 languages. English instruction occupied the mornings. Chinese translation was available throughout the day. German instruction occurred in the afternoons twice a week. Italian assistance was available on the 2 mornings when the Italian woman came. This was not a system that the educational authorities had sanctioned. It was a system that had grown up in response to an immediate need, in the practical way that necessity creates solutions in places where official channels move too slowly for the problem at hand. The school produced, by the accounts of the community in subsequent years, children who were literate in their home languages and functional in English, which was what the Australian colonies needed from its school system if it was to work. Whitmore's own accounts of the school, in letters to his brother in England, describe the situation with a mixture of bemusement and satisfaction. He had not expected to run a multilingual school. He had not expected to be doing any of this in the Australian goldfields, but the work, as he described it, was interesting in ways that a conventional English school had not been. The school closed in 1861 when the goldfields community dispersed. Many of its former students stayed in the Ballarat region and are findable in subsequent census records as farmers and tradespeople and merchants. The Chinese students are harder to trace because the colonial record-keeping of Chinese names was unreliable, but some of them appear in the records of the Chinese community that remained in Ballarat after the gold rush period. James Whitmore moved to Melbourne in 1862 and taught in a conventional English school until his retirement in 1885. His letters to his brother are in the State Library of Victoria, filed among a collection of correspondence from Victorian educators of the colonial period. Number 20, the town whose clock never stopped. In a regional town in the central west of New South Wales, there is a public clock mounted on the post office building that has been running continuously since it was installed in 1887. This is not in itself remarkable. There are public clocks in many Australian towns that have kept running for long periods. What is somewhat remarkable is what kept this clock running through the periods when you might have expected it to stop. The post office building was damaged in a fire in 1923. The fire destroyed the interior of the building but left the exterior walls standing, and the clock tower, which was attached to the exterior wall, survived. The clock mechanism, running on the weights and springs of the original installation, continued to run through the fire and the period of reconstruction that followed. The building was vacant for 18 months while repairs were made. During those 18 months, nobody was winding the clock because nobody was in the building, and yet the clock ran. Investigation after the fact determined that the clock had been designed with a winding mechanism that could be accessed from the exterior of the building, a feature that the original builders had included because they anticipated that the postmaster might not always be available to wind it from the inside. A townsperson, no one has ever been clearly identified, had been winding the clock during the period of the post office's vacancy, climbing the exterior of the building to reach the winding mechanism and keeping the clock running through 18 months of institutional absence. When the post office reopened, the clock was still running and showing the correct time. The clock ran through the Depression years when the town's economy was severely contracted, and the post office's staff was reduced to a single postmaster who wound the clock as part of his daily routine even when the rest of his duties had diminished to near nothing. It ran through the Second World War, when the clock's mechanism was examined by a government assessor who was looking for materials that could be contributed to the war effort and was found to contain nothing that could be usefully repurposed. It ran through the modernization of the 1960s, when a proposal was made to replace the mechanical clock with an electric clock that would not require winding. The proposal was rejected by the local council, not on historical grounds, but on the practical grounds that an electric clock would require a power supply that the post office exterior did not conveniently have. The clock is still running. The mechanism has been maintained and repaired over the years, with replacement of worn parts where necessary. But the basic movement is the original installation of 887. The postmasters of the town have wound it as part of their duties for more than a century. The townsperson who wound it through the fire and the reconstruction, who climbed the exterior of a damaged building 18 months to keep a clock running in a vacant post office, is not identified in any record. They did not do it to be remembered. They did it because a clock that ran was better than a clock that had stopped, and because someone needed to wind it, and they were there. Number 21. The census that listed a town that did not exist. The census conducted in Queensland in 1891 was, by the standards of the time, a reasonably thorough exercise in counting the colonial population. Census enumerators travelled to remote areas of the colony, collecting information about who lived where and what they did for a living, and how many children they had. In the western districts of Queensland, where the pastoral industry spread across vast areas of thinly populated country, the census enumerators relied partly on self-reporting. Station managers were given forms and asked to complete them for all persons on the station. The forms were collected by the enumerator on their circuit through the district. One form was returned for a location that listed 47 residents, a school, a store, a church, and a blacksmith shop. The settlement was given a name that appeared on none of the official maps of the district and that the enumerator did not recognize. The enumerator included it in the returns with a note that the location was unfamiliar to him, but that the form had been completed by someone who appeared to know what they were about. The census tabulation included the settlement and its population of 47 in the count for the district. When historians of Queensland's settlement patterns examined the 1891 census in the late 20th century, this settlement attracted attention. 47 residents with the infrastructure of a functioning small town should have been visible in other records, in land grants, in licensing records, in church records, in school registration documents. But none of these supporting records could be found. The leading hypothesis is that the form was completed by someone who was playing a practical joke on the census administration, or who had a specific reason to inflate the apparent population of the district, or who simply made a mistake about the location they were describing and filled in details about a settlement that was actually some distance away and was recorded elsewhere in the census under its correct name. All of these explanations are plausible. None of them can be confirmed. The settlement with 47 residents and a church and a school and a blacksmith remains in the 1891 census returns for Queensland, listed, counted, and unlocatable. It is a ghost community in the official record, present in the count and absent from the landscape. The 47 people it contained, if they existed, have not been identified. Their names are not on the form, which listed only the totals and the settlement's facilities. They counted as Queenslanders in the census of 1891 and have left no further trace. Number 22, the whaling station that became a garden. On the coast of the Great Australian Bight, where the cliffs of the Nullarbor Plain drop into the Southern Ocean in a series of dramatic vertical faces that are among the longest uninterrupted coastal cliffs in the world, there was in the early 20th century a small whaling station. The station processed the southern right whales that were a major target of the whaling industry in southern Australian waters. The industry was not, by the standards of the time, a gentle one, and the environmental consequences of southern right whale hunting in Australian waters were severe. The population of southern right whales in the waters of the Great Australian Bight was substantially reduced during the period of active whaling, and the recovery has been slow and incomplete. The station operated for about 20 years, from roughly 1910 to 1930, when the decline in whale numbers and the economics of the industry made it no longer viable. When it closed, the infrastructure of the station was left in place, as these things often were. The boiling pots and the processing equipment and the storage tanks were expensive to remove and had limited value in any alternative location. The people who had worked the station and lived in the small settlement attached to it moved on. The buildings were empty, the coast was empty. The Southern Ocean continued to throw itself against the base of the cliffs. What happened next was unexpected and gradual. The nitrogen-rich residues from the whale processing, absorbed into the soil over 2 decades of operation, created an unusually fertile patch of ground in an environment that was otherwise characterized by thin soils and harsh conditions. Seeds carried by wind and by birds landed in this fertile ground and germinated. Plants that would not normally thrive on the coastal clifftop in this region grew vigorously in the spot where the whale oil had seeped into the earth. Within a decade of the station's closure, the site had developed a distinctive patch of vegetation, more lush and varied than the surrounding scrubland, a consequence of the inadvertent fertilization of 20 years of processing. By the 1950s, when travelers along the edge of the Nullarbor occasionally visited the site out of curiosity, the old station had developed a peculiar character. The rusting processing equipment sat in the middle of what looked like a small but genuine garden. Plants growing up through and around the machinery, the metal and the vegetation coexisting in the way that only happens when a long time has passed. A botanist who visited the site in the 1970s noted that the plant community was unusual for the region, containing species that were not common in the surrounding environment and whose presence was most easily explained by the enriched soil conditions. The site was, he wrote in his field notes, an accidental garden produced by industrial waste, beautiful in spite of everything. The whaling station site is accessible via the Nullarbor Plain, though reaching it requires some effort. The vegetation continues to distinguish the site from its surroundings. The southern right whales, whose processing created the conditions for the garden, have been protected since 1935 in Australian waters, and the population in the Bight has slowly, partially recovered. The whales that come to the Great Australian Bight each year to calve and nurse their young in the protected waters below those enormous cliffs are not the descendants of the specific animals processed at that station, but they are the descendants of a population that survived the industry that created the garden. The garden and the whales coexist, separated by a cliff face, connected by a history that neither acknowledges. Number 23. The dentist of the desert. In the annals of the outback medical and dental history of Australia, there are figures who made regular circuits of remote communities, travelling enormous distances to provide services to people who had no other access to professional care. One of the more unusual of these figures was a dentist named Albert Forsyth, who operated a travelling dental practice in the far inland of South Australia in the 1920s and 1930s. Forsyth had qualified as a dentist in Adelaide and had briefly operated a practice in a suburban Adelaide street before concluding that suburban dentistry was not what he wanted from his professional life. He equipped a camel with panniers containing his dental equipment, a basic but functional kit that allowed him to perform extractions and simple repair work, and he set out to make a circuit of the remote station communities of the far inland. The circuit took approximately 4 months to complete. Forsyth would arrive at a station and set up his equipment in whatever space was available, often a station kitchen or a shearing shed, and he would treat everyone on the station who needed dental care. He charged what people could afford, which in many cases was very little, and accepted payment in kind when cash was not available. He had developed a particular technique for working under field conditions that prioritized the most essential interventions, relieving pain and preventing infection, over the more elaborate restorative work that his urban colleagues spent most of their time on. In the outback, the most important thing was the extraction of infected teeth that were causing pain and potentially endangering health. Everything else was secondary. Forsyth's arrival at a station was anticipated with a mixture of dread and relief that is familiar from the accounts of similar itinerant medical practitioners. The dread was of the procedure. The relief was for the end of the pain that had often been building for months since his last visit. He kept notes on the patients he treated, basic records of what work he had done and what he had observed, and these notes are in the collection of the History Trust of South Australia. They are practical documents, clinical records of the kind that a dentist keeps as a matter of professional habit, but they also contain occasional observations about the communities he visited, the conditions of the outback in particular seasons, the changes he observed over the years in the populations he served. Forsyth's notes describe the drought years of the 1930s with particular vividness, not because he was a literary writer, but because the drought was impossible to ignore. Station populations were reduced. People who had been on the circuit for years were gone, moved to town when the station they had worked became unviable. Children who had been born at stations on his circuit were not there when he came back the following year, their families having left for somewhere that offered more security than a drought-stricken station in the far inland. He continued the circuit through the drought. There were still people who needed dental care. As long as there were people, he made the journey. Forsyth retired from the circuit in 1941 when he was in his mid-60s and returned to Adelaide. He died in 1953. His camel, which he had named after a former South Australian politician, whose name he declined to specify in any document that has survived, died in 1938, and the subsequent years of the circuit were conducted with a truck. The truck did not have the same character as the camel, but it did not require the same care, and in a circuit of that length, that was something. Number 24. The Parliament that met in a pub. In the early days of colonial self-governance in Australia, the institutional infrastructure of parliamentary democracy was not always what it is today. The buildings in which colonial legislatures met were often improvised, inadequate, or simply not yet built, and the practical business of government proceeded wherever space could be found. In one of the smaller colonies in the 1850s, there was a period of several weeks during which the legislature met in the main room of a public house. The colonial government building was being repaired after storm damage, and the alternatives available were limited. The proprietor of the public house, recognizing both a commercial opportunity and a civic duty, offered the premises for the legislature's use. The legislature accepted. The bar was closed during legislative sessions, which was both practically necessary and enormously unpopular with the regular patrons of the establishment. The tables were rearranged, chairs were brought in, a kind of order was maintained. The debates that occurred in the pub during this period were, by the accounts of the legislators who participated in them and the journalists who reported on them, substantially similar to the debates that occurred in the official chamber. The business of government proceeded. Bills were introduced and debated, votes were taken. There was, it must be said, a somewhat different atmosphere. The smell of beer and tobacco was, one journalist noted, a reminder of the realities that the formal architecture of government was designed to conceal. The representatives of the people were meeting where the people met, which had a democratic virtue that the official chamber, with its elaborate furniture and its elevated presiding officer, did not quite achieve. The legislature returned to its official premises when the repairs were completed. The pub returned to being a pub. The patrons returned to the bar. The debates and votes that occurred during the temporary arrangement were all official, all properly recorded, all legally valid. They are in the parliamentary records of the colony, indistinguishable in their formal content from the debates that occurred before and after in the official chamber. Only the context was different, only the smell was different, only the reminder of where the authority of governments actually comes from. Number 25. The island that voted to stay British. In 1901, when the 6 Australian colonies federated into the Commonwealth of Australia, one island off the coast of the new nation chose not to join. Norfolk Island, a volcanic island in the Pacific Ocean, roughly 1,600 kilometres east of the Australian mainland, had been under British administration since 1788, when it was first settled as a secondary penal colony. By 1901, it was inhabited primarily by the descendants of the Pitcairn Islanders who had been relocated there in 1856, themselves the descendants of the Bounty mutineers and their Tahitian partners. The Federation of Australia in 1901 did not automatically include Norfolk Island. The island's status was a matter that required separate legal action, and the question of whether Norfolk Islanders wanted to be part of the new Commonwealth was, at least in theory, a question that deserved an answer. The answer that Norfolk Island's community gave, informally and without a formal referendum, was that they preferred to remain under direct British administration for the time being. This was not a rejection of Australia as such. It was an expression of the island's sense of its own distinct identity, rooted in its unique history as a community descended from the Bounty mutineers and their Tahitian partners. Norfolk Island was eventually incorporated into Australian administration in 1914, when it was made a territory of the Commonwealth. The incorporation was not entirely welcomed by everyone on the island. The Norfolk Islanders had developed a strong sense of community self-governance over the decades since their arrival, and Australian administration represented an external imposition that did not always sit comfortably with that tradition. The tension between Norfolk Island's desire for self-determination and the Australian government's exercise of sovereignty over the island has continued through the 20th century and into the 21st. In 2015, the Australian government significantly changed the island's governance arrangements, removing the elected legislature that had been the centre of local self-government, in a move that many Norfolk Islanders experienced as deeply unwelcome. The descendants of the Bounty mutineers, who have been on Norfolk Island for nearly 2 centuries, who arrived from Pitcairn Island in 1856 to a place they had never seen and made it home, who developed a language, the Norfolk language, that blends English and Tahitian in ways that are unique in the world, are a community with a deep sense of their own particularity. They voted informally to stay British in 1901. They were made Australian in 1914. They have been asking in various ways and with various degrees of success to be recognised as something more than just another Australian territory ever since. The Norfolk language is still spoken on the island. The descendants of Fletcher Christian and Isabella are still there. The relationship with Australia is still complicated. Some identities are very difficult to dissolve, even with the machinery of government. Number 26. The fence that changed a continent. The dingo fence, or the dog fence as it is officially known, is the longest fence in the world. It runs for approximately 500-600 kilometres across the southern part of Australia, from the coast of Queensland near Jimbour, through New South Wales and across South Australia to the Nullarbor Plain. It was built to keep dingoes out of the sheep grazing areas of the southeastern states. The fence has been maintained and rebuilt in various sections over the decades since its construction, which began in the 1880s and continued into the early 20th century. The maintenance is a significant ongoing enterprise, employing people whose sole purpose is to patrol specific sections of the fence, check for damage, repair holes, and deal with the animals that damage it. But the dingo fence has done something that its builders did not anticipate, and that has been the subject of ecological study for several decades. It has created, on either side of it, 2 distinctly different ecological systems. On the northern and western side of the fence, where dingoes are present, the ecosystem functions in a way that includes the regulation of kangaroo numbers by dingo predation. The kangaroo populations are kept in check. The grass is not overgrazed. The vegetation maintains a certain resilience. On the southern and eastern side of the fence, where dingoes have been largely excluded, the absence of apex predator pressure has allowed kangaroo populations to expand significantly. The increased kangaroo grazing has changed the vegetation structure. The soil in some areas has been compacted by grazing pressure that the ecosystem without dingoes cannot regulate. The ecological communities on the two sides of the fence have diverged. A fence built to protect sheep has, over the course of a century, created two different ecological experiments running in parallel across a continental scale. The people who built the fence were practical people solving a practical problem. They were not ecologists. The concept of ecosystem regulation by apex predators and the ecological cascades that follow from the removal of those predators was not well understood when the fence was built. It is well understood now, and the dingo fence is one of the clearest large-scale illustrations of the concept available anywhere in the world. The fence also crossed, in its construction, the territories of Aboriginal peoples who had lived on both sides of the fence's route for thousands of years, without any physical barrier between those territories. The fence's construction required labor that was partly Aboriginal, and the fence itself subsequently acted as a boundary that complicated movement across country that had been traversed without restriction for all of human history in Australia. The fence is still there, it is still being maintained. The ecological experiment it created is still running. The dingoes on one side and the sheep on the other, and the kangaroos on both sides are still playing out the consequences of a decision made in the 1880s to draw a line across the continent. Number 27. The priest who mapped the stars from the outback. In the late 19th century, an Irish-born Catholic priest named Father Nicholas Doyle was posted to a parish in the far west of New South Wales, in country that was even then recognised as being among the more challenging pastoral environments in Australia. Doyle was not a trained astronomer. He had a general education appropriate to a man of his calling, which, in the Irish Catholic tradition of the time, included some classical learning and enough mathematics to manage parish accounts. He did not arrive in the outback with any particular intention of studying the sky. But the sky in the far west of New South Wales in the 1880s was extraordinary. The absence of light pollution, which is now recognized as a significant problem for astronomical observation in most inhabited places, simply did not exist. The sky over the western division of New South Wales was as dark as any sky available to observers in the southern hemisphere, which is to say that it was extraordinary, a sky crowded with stars, and with the diffuse light of the Milky Way, and with the Magellanic Clouds, and with features that are invisible from any location where human settlement has made enough light to compete with the stars. Doyle began observing. He obtained a small telescope through a supplier in Sydney, a modest instrument but adequate for his developing interests. He began recording what he observed, the positions of stars, the behavior of planets, the appearance of the sky under different atmospheric conditions. He maintained detailed logs of his observations over a period of more than 15 years. He also began corresponding with astronomers at the Sydney Observatory, sending his observations and asking questions about what he was seeing. The astronomers responded. They were interested in observations from western New South Wales because the dark skies of the interior were genuinely useful for certain kinds of astronomical work, and a careful observer with a small telescope in that location could collect data that was valuable to the professional observatory. Doyle's correspondence with the Sydney Observatory extended over many years. His observations were incorporated into the observatory's records. He was not a professional astronomer, and he did not publish professional astronomical papers, but he contributed, in the way that careful amateur observers sometimes do, to the body of data from which professional astronomers draw. He also converted the choir loft of his church into an observation platform, removing the roof above it and installing a simple dome arrangement that allowed his telescope to be pointed in any direction. The parish was initially uncertain about this modification, but Doyle was persuasive in explaining the value of astronomical observation, and the loft continued to function as a choir loft on Sundays and as an observation platform on clear nights. Doyle died in 1903 and was buried in the small cemetery attached to his church. The telescope was donated to a school in Broken Hill. The observation platform in the choir loft was eventually restored to a more conventional choir loft configuration. The logs of his observations are in the archives of the Sydney Observatory. They are a 15-year record of the southern sky as seen from the far west of New South Wales by a man who was not supposed to be an astronomer, but who could not look at that sky and not try to understand it. Number 28, the voice that recorded the language last. In 1960, a linguist named Arthur Capel visited an elderly woman in a coastal community of New South Wales and recorded on a portable reel-to-reel tape recorder several hours of speech in a language that was already severely endangered. The woman, who was in her 80s, was the last fully fluent speaker of a language whose name I will not use here, because the use of certain words connected to particular people or communities is governed by protocols that should be respected. She had been born into a community where the language was still the primary means of communication. The colonial disruption of the mid-19th century had reduced the community that spoke it. The forced relocations and the mission system had further reduced it. By 1960, she was alone in her knowledge of it in the fullest sense. She was not unaware of what this meant. She had been watching the language leave the world for decades, departing with each person who had spoken it fluently and who died without having had the opportunity to pass it on in the circumstances that would have made such passing on possible. She spoke to Capel for several hours across 2 days. She spoke the language as it should be spoken, not haltingly, not with the gaps and uncertainties of someone who is partly forgotten, but fluently, with the ease of a person for whom this is the natural medium of thought and expression. She told stories, she sang songs, she described the world in the language that the world had first been described to her in. Capel recorded it all. He transcribed what he could. He wrote a preliminary grammar of the language based on what she had told him. He submitted his work to the relevant academic journals and archives. The woman died several years after the recording was made. The tapes are in the archive of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, which holds one of the largest collections of recorded Indigenous languages in the world. The transcription and grammar that Capel produced are available to researchers. Descendant communities of the people who spoke this language have used the recordings in language revival work, drawing on what the tapes preserve to reconstruct what can be reconstructed and to teach what can be taught. This work is difficult. A tape recording and a grammatical description are not the same as a living language community, and the gap between having a record of a language and having a living language is enormous, but the recordings exist. The woman's voice exists on those tapes in that archive, speaking the language she was born into. The language she was among the last to know fully, speaking it with the ease and the fullness that a language sounds like when it is alive. That is something. It is not enough, but it is something. Number 29. The station that kept its records in Latin. Among the records of the pastoral industry of 19th century Australia, there are station journals and account books, and correspondence in various hands and various styles, reflecting the educational backgrounds of the people who kept them and the circumstances under which they worked. One station in the Riverina district of New South Wales maintained its official records, the stock tally books, the financial accounts, the correspondence with suppliers and agents, entirely in Latin from 1867 to 1893. The reason for this is not mysterious, though it is unusual. The station manager appointed in 1867 was a man named Edmund Fitzgerald, who had been educated at a Jesuit school in Ireland, and who had subsequently spent several years studying for the priesthood before concluding that the religious life was not what he wanted. He had come to Australia in his late 20s and had found work in the pastoral industry, where his intelligence and organizational ability quickly led to his appointment as manager of a significant Riverina station. Fitzgerald kept the records in Latin because Latin was the language in which he had been educated to think precisely and to write carefully. His English was fluent, but, in his own estimation, not equal to the precision of thought that the records required. Latin for Fitzgerald was the language of clarity. The other employees of the station did not read Latin. This was potentially a problem for the practical functioning of the operation, but Fitzgerald managed it by keeping a separate set of practical daily notes in English for the use of the stockmen and the other workers, reserving the Latin records for the formal accounts and correspondence. The result was a station whose official archive is in Latin and whose informal records are in English, a situation that subsequent historians and archivists have found both inconvenient and interesting. The Latin records are precise and detailed. They reveal a methodical mind that brought to the management of a sheep station the same rigorous attention to order and documentation that had presumably been instilled in Fitzgerald's Jesuit education. The accounts balance to the penny. The stock tallies are maintained with a consistency that was not universal in the pastoral records of the period. The correspondence, when it can be translated, shows a man who communicated with the sharpness and clarity that the Jesuits valued. Fitzgerald retired in 1893 and returned to Ireland. He left behind a 26-year archive of a Riverina sheep station in Latin, a document that occupies an odd corner of Australian pastoral history. The archive is in the Mitchell Library in Sydney. The librarian who catalogued it in the 1940s noted in the catalogue entry that the records are remarkable for their precision and that their language presents a challenge for researchers unfamiliar with classical Latin. He added that anyone sufficiently motivated by the challenge would find the records worth the difficulty. Number 30, the hospital ship that became an island. In the waters off the coast of Queensland in the years following the First World War, there were a number of surplus ships that the government needed to dispose of. Some were sold, some were scrapped, one became something else. A hospital ship that had served in the war was acquired by a private individual in the early 1920s, who moored it off a small island in the Great Barrier Reef and converted it into a resort. The ship was anchored, not beached, and guests could come and go by launch from the nearest town. The ship provided accommodation, and the reef provided the attraction. The resort operated for several years, during which it was visited by tourists and by various notable figures whose names appear in the guest book, which has survived and is in a Queensland archive. The guest book records a clientele that included prospectors, naturalists, at least 2 members of parliament, a famous Australian cricketer whose name appears alongside a note in the margin in what appears to be a different hand, suggesting that he caught a very large fish, and a number of people who were identified only by initials and who may have preferred it that way. In the late 1920s, the owner of the converted hospital ship died, and the ship passed to his estate, which did not have the organizational capacity to continue operating the resort. The ship was left at anchor for an extended period, during which it gradually deteriorated. The tropical climate and the marine environment are not kind to ships that are not being maintained, and the hospital ship-turned-resort showed the effects of its abandonment within a few years. A cyclone in 1934 completed the process. The storm drove the ship onto the reef itself, where it settled into the coral and remained. Over the subsequent decades, the ship became part of the reef environment. Coral grew on the hull. Marine life colonized the structure. The hospital wards and the resort accommodations and the spaces between became habitat in the way that all shipwrecks eventually do. The wreck is still there, identifiable by divers who know where to look. Its outline still visible beneath the coral growth that has accumulated over 90 years. Fish move through what was once the hospital ward. The guest book is in the archive with the cricketer's initials and the marginal note about the large fish. The ship served as a hospital, and then as a hotel, and then as a reef. 3 careers in one hull, each one complete. Number 31, the Aboriginal cricket team that toured England. In 1868, a cricket team composed of Aboriginal Australian players toured England, playing 47 matches against English county and club sides. This was, by a considerable margin, the first Australian cricket team to tour England, predating by 12 years the more famous tour of 1880 that is usually described as the beginning of Test cricket between Australia and England. The 1868 team was recruited from the Lake Wallace area of Western Victoria, organised by a station manager named William Hayman, and managed by an Englishman named Charles Lawrence. The players were skilled cricketers who had been playing the game as it was introduced to them by the white settlers who had arrived in their country. They had adapted to it and in some cases developed considerable skill in it. The tour was a success in terms of cricket results, with the Australian team winning or drawing the majority of their matches. It was also a significant public event in England, attracting large crowds who came partly from cricketing interest and partly from a colonial curiosity about Aboriginal Australians that was not always expressed in ways we would now find comfortable. The players were expected during the tour to provide demonstrations of traditional skills, including boomerang and spear throwing, as a kind of sideshow to the cricket. This was standard practice in the way that Indigenous peoples were presented to European audiences throughout the colonial period, a reduction of complex cultural knowledge to entertaining spectacle. The players endured this. They also played cricket, and they played it well. Several members of the touring party died during or shortly after the tour, from respiratory illnesses contracted in the English climate that their immune systems were not equipped to resist. The names of those who died are recorded in the historical accounts of the tour, and their deaths are a reminder that the tour was not simply an adventure or an opportunity, but an experience that exacted a real cost. The survivors returned to Australia, one of the most skilled players on the team, a man known as Johnny Mueller, returned to Western Victoria and continued playing cricket locally for several decades. He is commemorated by a statue in Harrow, Victoria, which is near where he spent his later years. The 1868 tour is now recognised in the history of Australian cricket as an important moment, and the players are recognised as significant figures. They did not receive this recognition in their lifetimes. In their lifetimes, they were Aboriginal men who played cricket, which meant something different in the colonial context than it means now. The stories they carried back from England, the impressions of a country that had taken their land while they were playing cricket on its descendants' grounds, are not recorded in any document that has survived. They are the most interesting part of the story and the most completely lost. Number 32. The waterhole that fed a town. In the dry interior of South Australia, there is a waterhole that has been used as a water source continuously for a period of time that is difficult to precisely measure, but that the archaeological evidence suggests may extend back several thousand years. The waterhole is not large. It is a relatively modest feature in a dry creek bed, fed by subsurface water that rises consistently through even the driest years. The water is not excellent in quality, slightly mineralized, and with a taste that visitors have described variously as earthy, medicinal, and interesting, but it is reliable. And in the country where it is located, reliability is worth more than excellence. The Aboriginal people of the area had used the waterhole for as long as they had been in the country, which the most conservative archaeological estimates put at many thousands of years. It was a significant place in their geographical knowledge, a stop on routes across the interior, a location that was associated with the dreaming stories of the region. When European pastoralists moved into the area in the 1860s, they found the waterhole and recognized its value for the same reason the Aboriginal people had recognized it. The pastoral use of the waterhole was based on the same practical need for reliable water in dry country. A small settlement grew up near the waterhole in the 1870s. People who serviced the pastoral industry lived there, and the waterhole sustained them. A store was established, a small school, a church. The waterhole was the reason all of it was there. The settlement remained small. It never grew into the town that some of its early boosters predicted, but it persisted, because the waterhole persisted. The reliable water sustained a small community through droughts that emptied other settlements in the region. The settlement is still there, smaller now than it was at its peak, but inhabited. The waterhole is still there, still providing the reliable water that has made the location viable across a span of time that extends from the deep past of Aboriginal occupation through the colonial period and into the present. The people who use the waterhole now probably do not think much about the continuity of that use, the unbroken chain of people who have come to that specific place in that dry creek bed for thousands of years, because they needed what was there. But the chain is there, the waterhole holds it. Number 33, the library that floated. On the Murray River in the early 20th century, a barge was fitted out as a traveling library and sent along the river system to serve the communities on the riverbanks that had no fixed library and limited access to books. The library barge was not a permanent institution. It operated for a period of perhaps 15 years, during which it made regular circuits of the river, stopping at the towns and the farming communities and the pastoral stations along the banks, lending books, collecting returned books, and taking requests for titles that could be procured for the next circuit. The librarian who managed the barge and its collection for most of its operational period was a woman named Dorothy Ames, who had been a school teacher before taking the position, and who brought to the floating library the same combination of organizational competence and genuine belief in the value of books that had characterized her teaching. Ames kept records of the books that were borrowed and the communities they were borrowed from, which provides an interesting window into the reading habits of riverside communities in the early 20th century. The most borrowed books were adventure stories and practical guides, which was what you might expect from communities that valued both entertainment and useful knowledge. Poetry was borrowed more than might be expected, particularly by women, and the novels of particular Australian authors were sought out repeatedly at specific communities, where those authors had apparently developed local followings. Ames also kept a personal diary during the years on the barge, which is in the State Library of South Australia. The diary describes the communities she visited with a warmth and a precision that makes it a valuable social document quite apart from its relevance to library history. She writes about a farming family who asked her each visit whether she had any books about growing almonds. Not because they were growing almonds, but because they were thinking about growing almonds and wanted to read everything they could find before deciding. She writes about an elderly man who returned books with annotations in the margins, small penciled notes that extended the text in ways that were sometimes perceptive and sometimes eccentric and were always interesting. She writes about children who came to the barges to an event, running along the bank ahead of the arrival, waiting at the landing place, coming aboard with the confidence of regular visitors and knowing exactly where to find the books they wanted. The library barge was discontinued when improved road connections made it possible for books to be distributed by other means. The collection was distributed to the fixed libraries that had been established along the river. Dorothy Ames returned to school teaching. She died in 1962. The diary she kept on the barge is one of those documents that deserves more readers than it has found. Number 34, The Grave Without a Name. In cemeteries across the Australian outback, there are unmarked graves. This is not unusual. Many people who died in the outback in the colonial period were buried without the formality of a headstone, either because stone was unavailable, or because the people who buried them could not afford one, or because the people who buried them were moving on and had no way to commission one. One particular unmarked grave in a small cemetery in far western Queensland has attracted more attention than most, not because of what is known about it, but because of what is not. The grave was noted by a traveller passing through the district in 1891, who mentioned it in a letter to a relative in Brisbane as an interesting feature of the local cemetery. The traveller described a grave that had clearly been carefully dug and carefully mounded, with a small arrangement of stones at the head that was not quite a headstone, but that had clearly been placed with some intention of marking the location permanently. There was no inscription, no name, no date. The cemetery's records, which were kept by the local council from its establishment in the 1880s, do not record any burial in the location where the traveller described the grave. It is either not in the records, or the records are incomplete, or the grave predates the records. Local inquiry in 1891 produced no information. The people in the district at that time did not know who was buried there. The oldest residents had no memory of a burial in that location. Subsequent inquiries in the 20th century produced no additional information. The grave is there. The arrangement of stones at the head is still there, weathered but intact. The records still do not record who is in it. People in the district have made various suggestions over the years. An explorer who died before the district was settled, a traveller who died and was buried by companions who moved on without reporting it, an Aboriginal person buried by their community before the establishment of the colonial cemetery, whose grave was subsequently incorporated within the cemetery boundary as it expanded. Any of these could be right, none of them can be confirmed. The grave is tended occasionally by locals who feel that the person beneath deserves to be treated with the same care as the named dead around them. Someone puts a small bunch of wildflowers on the stone arrangement periodically. No one has established who does this. The grave does not know what it is waiting for, but it is well maintained given the circumstances. Number 35. The expedition that took no scientists. The Burke and Wills expedition of 1860 and 1861, the famously disastrous attempt to cross the continent from south to north, is remembered in Australian history primarily for its failure and for the deaths of its leaders. Less often noted is the scientific dimension of the expedition, or rather, the almost complete absence of one. The expedition was funded and organized partly on the expectation that it would produce scientific results, observations of the flora and fauna and geology of the interior, that would add to the body of knowledge about the continent. To this end, a scientist was supposed to accompany the expedition as a naturalist. The scientist hired for this purpose withdrew from the expedition before it left Melbourne. His withdrawal was the result of disagreements with Robert Burke, the expedition's leader, about the terms of his engagement and the respect that would be accorded to his scientific work during the journey. Burke did not replace him. The expedition departed with extensive logistical support and no scientific personnel. The consequence was that the regions of the continent that the expedition traversed, much of which was not known to European science at the time, were observed by people who had neither the training nor the equipment to record what they saw in scientifically useful ways. The journals and notebooks kept by the expedition members contained descriptions of the landscape and the vegetation and the wildlife, but these descriptions are the work of men trained as police officers, surveyors, and explorers rather than as naturalists, and they lack the systematic quality that scientific observation requires. There are descriptions of animals that have been tentatively matched to known species, but that might, if recorded more carefully, have revealed something new. There are descriptions of plants that are too vague to be botanically useful. There are descriptions of geological features that a trained geologist might have recognized as significant and that are recorded as simple landscape observations. The expedition crossed the continent, and most of its members died, and none of the scientific value it might have produced was extracted because a disagreement between two men who could not come to workable terms meant that the naturalist stayed home. The naturalist, whose name was Herman Becker, subsequently collected and described Australian natural history specimens in Victoria, contributing to the body of knowledge about southeastern Australia's biota. He is not a major figure in Australian natural history, but he is a documented and productive one. What he would have collected and described in the interior of the continent, on the route that Burke and Wills travelled at such great cost, is one of the smaller but genuinely interesting counterfactuals of Australian scientific history. Number 36, the Coral Sea Lighthouse. On a small coral cay in the Coral Sea, northeast of the Queensland coast, there was for several decades a lighthouse that was among the most isolated staffed lighthouses in Australian waters. Getting to the cay required a multi-day sea voyage from the mainland, and the cay itself was small, a strip of coral and sand that barely exceeded the height of a person above the normal high water mark in most places. The lighthouse had been established to guide shipping through a passage that was important for trade between Australia and its trading partners to the north and east. It was staffed by a keeper and an assistant keeper, who lived on the cay for extended periods, their contact with the mainland limited to the supply ships that came at intervals and the wireless equipment that allowed communication in emergencies. The conditions on the cay were extreme. The humidity was constant and high, the heat was intense, the supply of fresh water was limited to what could be collected from rain. The wildlife was abundant, but not always welcome, with large populations of seabirds whose nesting behavior conflicted with the lighthouse keeper's preference for unobstructed walkways. The keepers who staffed this lighthouse over its operational period adapted to these conditions in various ways, some of which are recorded in the operational logs they maintained, and some of which are recorded in the personal correspondence that has survived in various archives. One keeper kept tropical fish in a tank constructed from materials available on the cay, documenting the species he collected in a systematic way that produced observations of use to subsequent marine biologists. Another keeper planted a garden in the limited soil available, cultivating vegetables that supplemented the tinned provisions that arrived with the supply ships. A third keeper, during a prolonged period of calm weather that made for poor conditions for observing weather patterns, wrote a detailed account of the seabird populations of the cay that remains a useful baseline for researchers studying changes in the cay's bird life over time. The lighthouse was automated in the 1970s, as many remote Australian lighthouses were during that decade, when the technology had advanced to the point where a staffed station was no longer necessary for reliable operation. The last keepers left. The cay returned to the seabirds. The lighthouse continues to operate, maintained by periodic visits from the Australian Maritime Safety Authority. It guides shipping through the same passage it has guided shipping through since its establishment. But the tank full of tropical fish is gone, and the garden is gone, and the records of the seabirds are in an archive where they are consulted occasionally. The cay persists. The coral builds and erodes and builds again. The seabirds come and go with the seasons. The lighthouse keeps its light. Number 37. The mine that produced no gold. In the Kalgoorlie goldfields of Western Australia, among the hundreds of mining claims registered during the various gold rushes of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there are some that were worked for extended periods without producing any gold worth mentioning. This is not unusual. Most mining claims in any gold rush produce nothing. The nature of gold mining is that many claims are worked and few produce returns that justify the investment, and the willingness to invest is sustained by the successes that do occur and by the optimism that is the fundamental fuel of the mining industry. What is unusual is a mine that was worked for 14 years without producing any significant gold, and whose owner continued to work it not because of optimism about finding gold, but for reasons that seem to have had nothing to do with gold at all. The mine was registered in 1902 by a man named Thomas Fenwick. By the end of the first year of working, it was clear that the claim was not in productive country. The geological indicators that experienced miners used to identify productive areas were not present. The test pits produced nothing. A prospector with normal economic motivations would have abandoned the claim. Fenwick continued working it. His reasons, as far as they can be reconstructed from the accounts of people who knew him, and from a few letters he wrote that have survived, had to do with the mine itself rather than with what the mine might produce. Fenwick found in the work of mining a kind of discipline and a kind of isolation that he valued independent of any economic outcome. He lived at his claim. He kept the mine in order. He worked regular hours and maintained the equipment and the shaft and the drives with the same care that a productive mine would require. He also, it became apparent to the people who occasionally visited the claim, kept detailed records of the geology of the area through which his mine passed. His notebooks, which are in the Western Australian Museum, contain geological observations of the rock formations he encountered that are not the work of a formally trained geologist, but that show the kind of systematic attention that extended observation of a specific place can produce. When Fenwick finally left the claim in 1916, the notebooks he left behind were used by a geologist who was surveying the area, who found in Fenwick's 14 years of geological observation a useful record of conditions that would otherwise have been unavailable. The mine produced no gold, but it produced 14 years of careful geological observation by a man who apparently needed to be in a mine for reasons he did not fully explain to anyone. He died in Kalgoorlie in 1924. Whether he found what he was looking for in the mine is not recorded. Number 38, the town built on salt. On the shores of a salt lake in the interior of Western Australia, there was in the 1920s a town. The town's existence was contingent on an industry that extracted salt from the lake and shipped it to coastal processing facilities. The lake's salt deposits were substantial, the extraction technology was adequate for the period, and for a decade or more the industry was economically viable enough to support a settled community. The town had the usual elements of a small industrial community: housing for the workers and their families, a store, a school, a community hall where social events were organized and where, on at least one recorded occasion, an itinerant theatrical company performed for the residents. Living on the edge of a salt lake is a particular experience. The landscape is flat in a way that few landscapes are flat, the salt pan extending in all directions without the interruption of vegetation or variation in terrain that most landscapes provide. The light on the salt is intense, reflecting back at the observer from a surface that is both white and strangely luminous. In the heat of summer, mirages form above the salt surface, creating visual effects that are disorienting and sometimes beautiful. The families who lived in the town adapted to this landscape as families adapt to the landscapes they inhabit, finding its particular qualities first strange and then familiar. The children who grew up there have described, in accounts collected by regional historians in subsequent decades, a childhood that was marked by the salt pan in the way that childhood is always marked by the specific physical environment in which it is experienced. One woman who grew up in the town described the sound of the salt at night, a faint cracking and settling as the surface contracted in the cool temperatures, a sound she associated with sleep for the rest of her life, so that nights elsewhere always seemed slightly too quiet. The industry that sustained the town became uneconomical in the late 1930s. Cheaper sources of salt were available from other locations. The workforce was reduced, then eliminated. The town was abandoned in stages over several years. The buildings were removed where possible, left standing where removal was impractical. The school and the community hall were transported to other locations. The housing was mostly demolished. The salt lake continued to produce salt in the same way it always had, the evaporation cycles building up deposits that the wind then redistributed across the surface. The industry that had built around this process was gone, but the process continued. The site of the town is marked now by the remnants of the infrastructure that could not be easily moved. Concrete foundations, the ruins of the extraction equipment, a cluster of introduced shrubs that grew around the community's water point and that have persisted. The woman who remembered the sound of the salt at night lived until 1994. She spent her adult life on the coast of Western Australia, several hundred kilometers from the lake. Whether she heard its sound in her sleep for all those years is something only she knew. Number 39, the doctor who walked. In the early decades of the 20th century, a medical practitioner named James Rowe served a district in the far north of Queensland that covered an area of several thousand square kilometers and had a population scattered across pastoral stations and small settlements with minimal road connections between them. Rowe had a horse for some of his circuits, and, in the later years of his practice, a truck for the sections of his territory that had roads adequate for vehicular travel. But there were parts of his district that could not be reached by horse in the time available, and could not be reached by truck at all, and that required Rowe to travel on foot. He walked to his patients. He walked for distances that most people would have considered extreme for a man carrying a medical bag and maintaining a practice. A journey of 30 or 40 kilometers on foot to reach a patient in a remote location was within the range of what Rowe considered a normal working day. The patients he reached at the end of these journeys were people who had no other access to medical care. The distance that separated them from the nearest town was the same distance Roe had just walked, which meant it was a distance that sick people could not travel and that guaranteed, in the absence of someone like Roe, that medical care was simply not available. Roe kept a clinical diary across his years in the district, a record of the cases he treated and the outcomes he observed. The diary is in the collection of the James Cook University Library in Townsville, donated by his family after his death. The clinical diary is a record of medicine practiced under extreme resource constraints, of the diagnostic and therapeutic decisions available to a doctor with a medical bag, and his training in a location without hospitals, without pharmacies, without specialist referrals, without most of the infrastructure that defines medical practice in settled areas. It is also, incidentally, a record of the landscape through which Roe walked to reach his patients. He noted the weather conditions on his journeys, the state of the tracks, the wildlife he encountered, the conditions of the country through the seasons of successive years. One entry reads, "Set out before dawn to reach McKinnon Station. The grass has come well this season, and the country looks better than it has in several years. Arrive before noon. Mrs. McKinnon has a persistent chest infection that I have seen a good deal of in the district this winter. Provided what I could. Walked back in the afternoon, arriving in time for supper." The entry is typical: the clinical observation, the landscape observation, the practical notation of time and distance, all compressed into a few sentences that convey without drama or self-consciousness the texture of a working day. Roe retired in 1948 and died in 1963. The district he served has better roads now and a hospital in the largest town within it. The distances are the same. The landscape looks much as he described it, when the seasons are good and the grass comes well. Number 40. The Women's Letter Circle, in the remote pastoral districts of the Western Australian wheat belt in the 1930s. A group of women who lived on farms and stations separated by distances of tens of kilometers and connected by roads that were sometimes impassable in wet weather, organized a system of correspondence that sustained their social and intellectual lives through the difficulties of the Depression and the isolation that was inherent in their situation. The system was simple. One woman would write a letter and send it to the next woman in the circle, who would read it, add her own letter to the packet, and send it on to the next, and so on around the circle until it returned to the first woman, who would remove her original letter and replace it with a new one and send the packet on again. The packet that circulated among approximately 15 women in the district contained, at any given time, letters from all 15 of them. It was a portable community, a gathering of voices that crossed the distances between the farms without requiring the women to physically travel. The letters covered everything: practical agricultural information, the condition of crops and livestock, the state of the tracks and the water supplies. Social information, the births and deaths and marriages and illnesses that were the texture of community life. Reading recommendations. Recipes, arguments about things that mattered to the women, local politics, national politics, the management of their farms and households, and the ways those things might be improved. The letter circle continued through the 1930s and into the 1940s, when the improvement of telephone services in the district made its function partly redundant. It did not end abruptly, but diminished gradually as other communication became available, the women staying in occasional personal contact but no longer circulating the packet. Several women in the circle kept their accumulated letters. Collections of these letters are in the State Library of Western Australia and in the collections of the Batty Library of Western Australian History, donated by the families of women who had been in the circle. Reading these collections is reading a compressed record of community life in the Western Australian wheat belt during a particularly difficult decade. The Depression years appear in the letters not as the dramatic economic crisis of newspaper headlines, but as the accumulation of small difficulties that the women dealt with in their daily lives and wrote about to each other, because writing to each other was one of the ways they managed. The women were not famous. They were farmers' wives and farmers in their own right, living at distances from each other that the modern world would find extreme and that they found normal. They wrote letters to each other because they needed to talk, and because the need to talk does not diminish just because the distances are large. The letters are there. The voices in them are still clear. Number 41, the Camel Driver's Map. In the collections of the South Australian Museum in Adelaide, there is a map that was drawn in the 1890s by an Afghan camel driver named Mohammed Shah, who had been working in the Central Australian trade routes for approximately 15 years at the time of the map's creation. The Afghans, as they were called regardless of their actual national origins, which were often from what is now Pakistan rather than Afghanistan, were the camel handlers who made the Central Australian transport network function in the decades before the railways came. They drove the camel trains that carried supplies to the remote stations and the mining camps of the interior, following routes across waterless country that required both the camel's extraordinary capacity for sustained travel without water and the handler's knowledge of where water could be found. Muhammad Shah's map was not made for official purposes. It was made, as far as can be determined from the circumstances of its preservation, as a personal document, a record of the routes he knew, and the water sources along them, and the relationships between the places he traveled through. The map is unusual in several ways. It covers a vast area of Central Australia, from the Flinders Ranges in the south to the region around what is now Alice Springs in the north, and it documents water sources and tracks in that area with an accuracy that reflects 15 years of direct knowledge. But the map also contains information that official maps of the same period do not contain: names for places in languages that are not English, notations that appear to record observations about seasonal conditions at specific locations, marks that may indicate the locations of graves of people who died on the routes. The non-English names are a mixture. Some appear to be in the local Aboriginal languages of the regions the routes pass through, others in Urdu or Pashto, which were languages Muhammad Shah would have brought from his homeland and applied to new landscapes in the way that travelers always name the places they encounter. The map came to the South Australian Museum through a sequence of transfers that is not entirely clear, ending up in the collection sometime in the early 20th century. It has been studied by a small number of researchers who have found it valuable both as a practical record of Central Australian routes in the 1890s and as a document that reveals something about how the Afghan camelmen understood and navigated the country they spent their working lives crossing. Muhammad Shah's own subsequent history is not recorded in documents the museum has been able to trace. He made the map, and it ended up in the collection, and he continued, presumably, to drive camels across Central Australia for some additional period before the railway rendered his livelihood obsolete, and he went wherever the camelmen went when the work was done. The map is still in the collection. The routes it records are partly overridden by roads and partly still recognizable as features of the landscape. The water sources it marks can be checked against subsequent survey records and found, in most cases, to be accurately located. It is a careful document, made by someone who knew the country it described, who had earned that knowledge through years of direct and sustained engagement with a landscape that did not forgive ignorance. Number 42. The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter. On a lighthouse station on the south coast of Western Australia, in the 1890s, the keeper's daughter taught herself to read German from a grammar book that had arrived at the station among a collection of donated books sent by a church organization in Perth. The girl's name was Edith Sanderson. She was 12 years old when the books arrived, one of 3 children living at the lighthouse station with their parents, educated by correspondence and by their mother, who had been a school teacher before her marriage. The lighthouse station was remote. The nearest town was a day's journey by horse. Books were valuable, and the arrival of a collection of them was an event. Most of the donated books were standard English texts, improving literature of the Victorian kind, religious tracts, practical guides, but among them was a German grammar, presumably donated by someone clearing out a library and not paying close attention to what was suitable for a lighthouse station. Edith kept the grammar. She worked through it systematically, learning the declensions and the vocabulary and the basic sentence structures of a language that she would have no practical use for in her circumstances. She had no German speaker to practice with, and no German text to read beyond the grammar itself. She was teaching herself a language for no reason, except that the grammar was there and she was curious. When Edith was 15, her father was transferred to a different lighthouse station, and the family moved to a location on the coast near a small town. Edith enrolled in the town's school, which offered a curriculum somewhat more varied than correspondence and her mother's teaching. She discovered that the school had a German teacher, a woman who had emigrated from Bavaria in the 1870s, and who had, somewhat improbably, ended up in this coastal town teaching at the local school. The German teacher was astonished to find that one of her new students already had a working knowledge of German grammar, acquired through independent study of a donated book on a lighthouse station. She gave Edith more books: German literature, history, poetry. Edith spent the next 3 years reading them with the help of a teacher who was pleased, for the first time since her arrival in Australia, to have a student who was genuinely interested in the language. Edith Sanderson subsequently trained as a teacher herself, specializing in languages, and taught in schools in southwestern Western Australia for more than 30 years. She taught German, which was problematic during the First World War, and the Second World War, but which she maintained as a subject through both periods, arguing that a language was not responsible for the actions of the countries in which it was spoken. She retired in 1951 and died in 1968. A colleague who wrote a brief obituary for the school newsletter noted that she had learned German from a donated grammar on a lighthouse station and had never lost her interest in it. The grammar is not in any archive. It was probably worn out. Number 43, the sheep that walked home. In the pastoral history of Australia, there are accounts of individual animals, particularly horses and dogs, that demonstrated navigational abilities that seemed to exceed what should have been possible given the distances and the terrain involved. One of the more thoroughly documented cases involves a sheep, which is an unusual subject for this kind of story, since sheep are not generally thought of as animals with strong navigational instincts or the kind of individual personality that makes for memorable stories. The sheep in question was a merino ewe from a station in the Riverina district of New South Wales. In 1931, during the mustering of the station's flock for shearing, the ewe became separated from the mob and was not found during the initial search. This was not an extraordinary event. Sheep occasionally became lost during mustering, particularly in country with broken terrain. The lost sheep was noted in the station records, and the search was continued for several days before being called off. 7 weeks later, the ewe was found at the station home paddock, in the yard where the station's house sheep were kept. She had returned to the home paddock from a location that, when the point of separation was reconstructed from the mustering records, appeared to be approximately 140 kilometers away. The route she would have taken, assuming she had traveled relatively directly, would have passed through country that included several pastoral stations and significant natural barriers, including a stretch of the Murrumbidgee River. The station manager's account of the ewe's return was recorded in the station diary, which is in the Noel Butland Archives Centre at the Australian National University. The account is matter-of-fact in tone, as station diaries tend to be, noting the return as a fact to be recorded, rather than as a miracle to be celebrated. The ewe was thin, but apparently healthy, and was shorn with the rest of the flock at the delayed shearing. How she found her way back from 140 kilometers across unfamiliar country is not explained in the diary, and has not been explained by anyone who has subsequently examined the case. The best scientific consensus on sheep navigation suggests that sheep have reasonable short-range spatial memory, but that navigating over 140 kilometers is beyond what the research literature would predict. The ewe continued to live at the station for several more years before dying of old age. She was not given a name. The station records refer to her as the returned ewe or occasionally as the wanderer. She is the most thoroughly documented long-range navigating sheep in the available records of Australian pastoral history, which is an unusual distinction to hold. Number 44. The road that went nowhere on purpose. In the early days of European settlement in Australia, roads were built to connect places that needed to be connected. This is the ordinary logic of roads, and it mostly explains the road network of the colonial period. There is, however, one road in the historical record of New South Wales that was apparently built with the intention of not connecting anything specific. The road was constructed by convict labour in the 1830s, under the direction of an engineer whose name appears in the colonial records, but who did not leave any explanation of the purpose of the project. The road was built to a high standard for its time, with proper grading and drainage and a surface of compacted gravel that could sustain wheeled traffic in all weather. It ran for approximately 22 kilometers through hilly country west of the Blue Mountains. At its eastern end, the road connected to the Great Western Road, the main route across the Blue Mountains. At its western end, it stopped, not at a town, not at a station, not at a geographic feature that would have suggested a specific destination. It simply stopped in a location that offered no obvious advantage over the surrounding country. Subsequent research into the colonial records has not produced a satisfying explanation. The road appears in the public works accounts of the period as a completed project. The engineer who supervised its construction submitted a report confirming its completion. No record of the intended purpose of the road's western terminus has been found. Several theories have been proposed. The road may have been intended to continue to a location that was never reached, the project having been abandoned partway through for reasons not recorded. The road may have been built in connection with a settlement or a resource extraction site that was subsequently abandoned before the road was needed. The road may have been a make-work project that was never really intended to connect anything, the actual purpose being the employment of convict labor in organized work, rather than the specific infrastructure the work produced. The road itself persisted in the landscape for several decades before it was partially incorporated into local property tracts and partially overgrown. Elements of it were visible as late as the 1970s as a faint linear feature on aerial photographs of the area. The engineer who built it, whose name was Thomas McBride, subsequently worked on several other road projects in New South Wales and appears in the colonial records as a competent and unremarkable public works administrator. He did not explain the road that went nowhere in any document that has been found. It was a very good road. It just did not go anywhere in particular, at least not anywhere that anyone recorded. Number 45, the season that reversed. In the historical meteorological records of Victoria, there is a period in the 1870s that is referred to in subsequent accounts as the reversed season, a period of several months during which the normal seasonal pattern of weather in the southeastern part of the continent was significantly disrupted. The winter of 1875, which should, by the normal standards of Victorian weather, have been a period of cool temperatures and reliable rainfall, was instead a period of unusual warmth and drought. The summer that followed was cooler than normal and experienced rainfall patterns that were more typical of winter. This reversal of the expected conditions was not absolute. The temperatures were not tropical in winter or frigid in summer. But the deviation from expected conditions was significant enough to be widely noted at the time and to cause specific agricultural difficulties that are documented in the farming records and the correspondence of farmers in the affected regions. The philosophical implications of a reverse season for a colonial farming community were not trivial. The entire agricultural system of the colony had been organized around an understanding of seasonal patterns that had been established over the decades of European occupation of the land. Crops were planted at certain times because those times corresponded to the seasonal conditions that the crops required. Livestock were managed in ways that depended on knowing when the cold would come and when the warmth would return. When the seasons reversed, the planning that had been done on the basis of expected conditions was wrong. Crops planted in anticipation of winter rainfall did not receive it. Crops that had been planned for summer were caught by unexpected cold. The livestock management decisions that had been made in spring were based on assumptions that did not hold. Farmers adapted as farmers do, with the combination of practical flexibility and philosophical resignation that the agricultural life requires. Some crops were lost, others survived better than expected in the unusual conditions. The overall agricultural output of the colony for the relevant years was reduced, but not catastrophically. The reversed season was attributed, in the accounts of the time, to various causes, some of which anticipated later scientific understanding of the large-scale climate patterns that influence Australian weather, and some of which were simply wrong in the way that explanations often are when the underlying mechanisms are not yet understood. What the reversed season of 1875 demonstrated, to anyone paying attention, was that the climate of southeastern Australia was more variable than the short history of European settlement had suggested. The decades of relatively regular seasons that had preceded 1875 were not necessarily representative of the range of conditions that the continent could produce. This was a lesson that was not fully absorbed. The assumption of regularity, the expectation that the seasons would behave as they had behaved in the European agricultural tradition, and as they had behaved in the recent Australian settler experience, persisted. It would be tested again in more severe ways in the decades to come. The records of the reversed season of 1875 are in the meteorological archives and in the farming correspondence of the period. They are a small but clear document of a time when the continent reminded the people trying to farm it that it had not agreed to follow European expectations. Number 46. The children who named the waterhole. On a pastoral station in the Northern Territory, in the years following the First World War, the children of the station manager developed a habit of visiting a small waterhole about 3 kilometers from the homestead that was known to the station's Aboriginal workers by a name in their language and known to the station records by a grid reference. The children, 4 of them ranging in age from 6 to 13, gave the waterhole a third name. They named it for reasons that were entirely their own, having to do with a particular afternoon in which they had encountered a large blue-tongue lizard on the bank, and they called it the lizard hole, which they then translated through various stages of modification into a name that had nothing grammatically to do with lizards, but that sounded, they felt, like the place. They used this name among themselves consistently for several years, referring to it in their diaries and in the letters they wrote to relatives in Adelaide, and in the conversations they had with each other about the station and its features. When the family left the station in 1924, moving to a town in South Australia where the children could attend proper schools, the name they had given the waterhole went with them. It existed only in their shared memory and in the diaries they kept. The waterhole continued to be known to the Aboriginal workers by its proper name and to the station records by its grid reference. The family's youngest child, the 6-year-old at the time of the naming, lived until 1998. She mentioned the waterhole in an interview conducted by a researcher studying the social history of Northern Territory pastoral stations, describing it with the kind of clarity that very early memories sometimes retain across decades. She remembered the blue-tongued lizard, the texture of the bank, the way the water moved in the wind. She remembered the name they had given it, and the process of arriving at that name through the collaborative negotiations of 4 children, deciding together what a place should be called. The waterhole is still there, still known by its Aboriginal name and its grid reference. The name the children gave it existed for about 5 years, in the shared vocabulary of 4 children who lived near it, and then it dissolved when the children left, but the woman who had been 6 years old remembered it for 80 years. She could still say the name in 1998, and she did. The waterhole does not know that it once had 3 names, but it held one of them for a long time in one person's memory, and that seems like something. Number 47, the bridge they built twice. In the records of the Queensland Railway Network, there is a bridge over a river in the central west of the state that was built, destroyed, and then built again in a period of about 8 years, with the second building being essentially identical to the first. The bridge was first constructed in 1893 as part of the extension of a railway line into the pastoral districts of the Central West. The construction was straightforward, using the standard timber and ironwork techniques of Queensland railway construction in the period. The bridge was completed on time and open to traffic. In 1897, a flood of exceptional size came down the river. This flood exceeded what the bridge engineers had considered when designing the structure. The bridge was not simply damaged, it was removed from its position by the force of the water and deposited in pieces some distance downstream. The railway authorities assessed the situation and concluded that a bridge at this location was necessary for the continued operation of the line and that the bridge would need to be rebuilt. The engineers reviewed the flood data and concluded that the 1897 flood was an exceptional event unlikely to recur within a foreseeable planning horizon. They built the second bridge to the same specification as the first. The second bridge was completed in 1901 and opened to traffic. It served the railway line for several decades without incident, the 1887 flood remaining, in the available historical record, the worst flood to have affected this section of the river. Whether the engineers were right to build to the same specification, whether the 1897 flood was genuinely exceptional, or merely the upper end of a recurrence distribution that would eventually repeat, is a question that could be answered by looking at the flood records for the river over the full period of rainfall documentation. It is the kind of question that infrastructure planners face constantly, the trade-off between the cost of building to withstand rare but severe events and the cost of accepting the risk of damage if those events occur. In 1901, the engineers made a decision and built the bridge to the specification they thought appropriate. The bridge served the line. The flood did not come back, or at least it had not come back by the time the railway line was eventually closed and the bridge was no longer required. After that, it was no longer being maintained, and it is not clear what condition it is in now. The flood records remain in the Queensland Meteorological Archives. Whether the 1897 event is the worst in the record for that river is something a researcher could determine. The answer might be reassuring or it might not be. Number 48. The letter that arrived 40 years late. In the Australian Postal System's record of unusual deliveries, there is an account of a letter that was sent from a town in Victoria in 1903 and was delivered to its intended recipient in 1943, 40 years after it was mailed. The letter had been lodged in a postal facility in an intermediate town and had somehow been moved to a storage area where it remained, undelivered and apparently unnoticed, for 4 decades. The discovery of the letter was made during the renovation of the postal facility in 1943, when workers sorting through the contents of the storage area found a collection of undelivered mail from various periods, of which this letter was the oldest. The Postal Service located the intended recipient, who was still alive and still resident in the town to which the letter had been addressed. The intended recipient was in his 70s and was the letter's original addressee. He received the letter, opened it, and read it. The letter was from his father, who had written it when the son was in his early 30s, and who had died several years after writing it. The father's letter concerned a family matter of some domestic significance, a property dispute that had, at the time of writing, been a source of tension in the family. The property dispute had been resolved in ways unrelated to the letter some years after the letter was sent. The son, now in his 70s, read the letter from his long-dead father, addressing him as if he were 30 years old, discussing a situation that had been resolved long ago, in the voice of a man who had been dead for many years. He wrote a brief account of the experience at the request of the Postal Service, which was documenting the unusual delivery for its records. The account is in the Australia Post Historical Archive, a short document that describes the experience of receiving a letter from the dead with the quiet composure of a man in his 70s, who has had a long time to make peace with loss. He noted that the letter was welcome regardless of its tardiness, that his father's handwriting was as familiar to him as it had been 40 years earlier, and that the domestic matter it discussed, though long since resolved, had once been important enough that he could remember his feelings about it clearly. He did not say whether receiving the letter made him happy or sad. Perhaps it was both at once, in the way that letters from people who are no longer alive tend to be. Number 49, the pub that served no alcohol. In the goldfields of Victoria in the 1850s, there were establishments that called themselves hotels or public houses and that served meals and provided accommodation, but that served no alcohol, operating in an environment where the demand for alcohol was substantial and the social pressures around its provision were complex. One such establishment in the Ballarat region was operated by a woman named Martha Delaney, who had come from Ireland with her husband and who had opened the establishment after her husband died of fever in the first year of the gold rush. Delaney's decision to serve no alcohol was not a moral position, though she had strong views on the subject. It was a commercial decision. The licensed hotels of the goldfields were required to pay substantial licensing fees and to maintain the premises to licensing standards. Without a license, operating as a boarding house and dining room rather than as a hotel, she could avoid those costs and compete on price for the accommodation and meal trade while letting the licensed premises have the alcohol trade. The result was an establishment that was, by the accounts of the miners who used it, notably more orderly than the licensed hotels nearby. The absence of alcohol meant that the social dynamics of the premises were different. Arguments were less common. Violence was essentially absent. The food, which Delaney prepared with more care than was standard in the goldfields, was commented upon favorably by multiple visitors. Delaney's establishment was popular with specific segments of the goldfields population, particularly with the families who had come to the goldfields and who preferred an environment that was not organized around alcohol, and with men who were trying, with varying degrees of success, to avoid it. She operated the establishment for 12 years, from 1852 to 1864, and retired with sufficient savings to buy a small farm in the Ballarat district, which she operated until her death in 1889. Her account books, which have survived in the collection of the Ballarat Historical Society, show a business that was methodically managed and consistently profitable. The absence of alcohol did not prevent financial success. It may, in the specific environment of the goldfields, have contributed to it by differentiating the establishment clearly from its competitors and by attracting a clientele that valued what it offered. Martha Delaney is not a figure in Australian history. She is a footnote in the records of a goldfields business. But she ran a profitable business in difficult circumstances for 12 years and retired comfortably, which is a more successful outcome than most goldfields enterprises achieved. Number 50. The island that raised sheep without a shepherd. On one of the islands in the Bass Strait, in the early decades of the 20th century, a small flock of sheep was established by a mainland pastoralist who believed the island's grass would sustain them and who intended to visit annually for shearing. The sheep were landed on the island, which was uninhabited, and left to manage. The pastoralist visited for the first shearing, found the flock in reasonable condition, shore them, and returned to the mainland. He did not return the following year. The exact reason for his failure to return is not recorded. He may have died. He may have faced financial difficulties that made the boat hire for the visit unaffordable. He may simply have moved on to other interests. The sheep continued to live on the island. They had no predators. The island's grass, while not luxurious, was adequate for a small flock. The flock's wool grew and was not shorn and accumulated in the way that a merino's wool does when unmanaged. growing year after year into coats of enormous volume. The island and its unshorn sheep were discovered by fishermen who landed on the island for shelter during a storm in the late 1920s. The fishermen found a flock of sheep in a condition that combined the practical and the bizarre. Animals that were alive and apparently healthy, but whose accumulated wool was so extensive that they moved awkwardly and, in several cases, had begun to have difficulty seeing because the wool had grown over their faces. The fishermen were not equipped to do much about this. They made their way back to the mainland and reported what they had found. The island's sheep became known in the district. Various people landed on the island to observe them. Eventually, an organized shearing party visited the island, shore the animals, and removed the accumulated wool. The weight of wool shorn from some of the animals was extraordinary, far beyond what a normal annual fleece would contain. Some of the sheep continued to live on the island. Others were removed to the mainland. The flock gradually diminished over subsequent years as the older animals died without being replaced. The island is uninhabited now, as it was before the sheep were landed. Whether any descendants of the original flock persist is not clear from the available records. The island's grass grows and is grazed by whatever wildlife has found its way there across the water. The sheep that grew enormous coats in the absence of anyone to shear them are one of those small, strange footnotes that pastoral history occasionally produces. Number 51, the town that had 2 post offices. For a period of approximately 3 years in the 1880s, a town in the New South Wales tablelands had 2 operational post offices, each serving the same community and each claiming official status. The situation arose from a territorial dispute between 2 postal districts, whose boundaries had not been clearly defined when the town was established at a point that was, depending on how the measurement was made, either within one district or the other. Both district postmasters, noting the establishment of a significant new community within what each considered their territory, had applied for and received authorization to establish a post office in the town. The Central Postal Authority in Sydney, apparently not checking its records before authorizing the second application, had approved both. The 2 post offices operated simultaneously, each receiving mail addressed to the town, and each trying to deliver that mail. Letters addressed to residents of the town were received by one post office or the other, depending on which postal collection they had been sorted into. Recipients went to the post office where their mail was most likely to be, based on a pattern that developed over time as each office attracted certain parts of the community's correspondence. This situation produced practical problems that were occasionally amusing and occasionally seriously inconvenient. Important communications were sometimes at the wrong post office. Residents who expected a particular letter and went to the wrong post office and found nothing assumed the letter had not arrived when it had simply arrived at the other post office. The Central Postal Authority in Sydney was made aware of the duplication. Its response was slow because the Postal Authority had other matters to attend to and because the practical consequences of the duplication, while annoying, were not catastrophic. The situation was resolved when one of the 2 postmasters retired and the Central Authority declined to appoint a replacement, designating the remaining post office as the official facility for the town. This happened after approximately 3 years of double post office operation. The town subsequently had 1 post office, as towns normally do. The community adapted to having a single facility, with the ease that comes from having the normal restored. The records of the 3-year period of double operation are in the Postal Archives of New South Wales, a curious anomaly in the administrative history of the colonial postal system. Number 52. The reef that was named twice. On the Great Barrier Reef, a large coral structure was named, described, and charted by a British naval expedition in the early 19th century. The name given to the structure was entered in the navigational charts that subsequently guided shipping through the reef. Approximately 40 years later, a second British naval expedition, apparently unaware of the earlier charting, named the same structure differently, and entered this second name in its own charts. Both names appeared in official navigational documents. Charts from different periods used different names for the same reef. This created a situation in which ships using older charts and ships using newer charts were navigating with reference to the same physical structure under different names, a situation with obvious potential for confusion in communications between vessels or between vessels and shore authorities. The duplication was identified and a decision was made to use one name and retire the other. The name that was retained was the one from the later expedition, which was in wider circulation by the time the duplication was discovered. The name from the earlier expedition, which was the historically prior name, was retired. It appears in the older charts and in historical accounts of the reef, but not in current navigational documents. The reef itself is indifferent to what it is called. It has been accumulating coral for thousands of years, sustaining a complex ecosystem of fish and invertebrates and algae and all the other organisms that make reef ecosystems among the most biologically rich environments on Earth. The naming conventions of British naval expeditions are a very small footnote in the reef's history. But for navigators in the mid-19th century, knowing that the same structure had two names in different official documents was a matter of practical significance. The reef did not care what it was called. The ships that had to navigate around it did. Number 53, the first snow. In the records of a wool station in the tablelands of New South Wales, there is an account written by the station manager in the winter of 1876 of the first time he saw snow. The manager, a man who had grown up in coastal New South Wales and had spent his adult life in the pastoral industry in various parts of the interior, had never in his 43 years seen snowfall. He had seen pictures of it. He had read descriptions of it. He knew in the abstract what it was. He had not seen it. The winter of 1876 brought an unusual cold snap to the tablelands, and one morning in July, the station manager woke to find the paddocks white. His account of the experience is in the station diary, which is in the Mitchell Library in Sydney. It is a brief passage, not more than half a page, and it is written with the self-consciousness of a man who is aware that he is recording something personal in a document normally reserved for the practical business of station management. He describes looking out the window before dawn and not understanding for a moment what he was seeing, the white surface in the pre-dawn light registering as something unfamiliar before his mind supplied the correct interpretation. He describes going outside in his heavy coat and his boots and standing in the paddock as the sun came up and the snow revealed itself in the morning light. He put his hand in it. He mentions this specifically. He put his hand in the snow and felt the cold of it, the texture of it, the way it compressed slightly and retained the impression of his hand. He writes, "I have lived 43 years and have never seen this before, and I do not think I shall ever again not be glad to see it." The sentence is slightly tangled, as sentences sometimes are when they are trying to express something that resists straightforward formulation, but the meaning comes through. He was glad, he was genuinely glad, at 43 years old to have seen his first snow. The snow melted within a day. The station diary returns to practical matters, wool prices and stock numbers and the condition of the fences. The half page about the snow is there between them, a small record of a man's first encounter with a thing he had known about for his whole life and never experienced, and the gladness of finally knowing it. Number 54, the church at the end of the road. On the edge of the inhabited part of Australia's continental interior, there is a church that was built in the 1920s to serve a community that was already beginning to thin out. The church was built of local stone by the men of the community, who had been raised in a tradition that considered the building of a church a communal act of significance, an expression of a community's commitment to permanence in a landscape where permanence was always uncertain. The community that built the church was a scattered one, families on properties spread across a substantial area, connected by tracks and by the social and religious networks that kept them in relationship with each other across the distances that the country imposed. The church was the center of these networks in a physical sense, the place where they came together, the building that embodied the community's sense of itself as something more than just a collection of isolated households. The church was built with care. The stone walls are thick enough to moderate the temperature inside, cool in summer and retaining warmth in winter. The windows, which had to be shipped from a distant city at considerable expense, are placed to catch the morning light in a way that suggests someone thought about how the light would fall at the time of Sunday morning services. The community continued to thin. Each decade saw a few more families leave, moving to the towns where the children could get better schooling, and the adults could find work that was less dependent on the unpredictable rhythms of outback agriculture. The church's congregation diminished. By the 1960s, services were being held only sporadically, when a visiting minister made the long circuit that took in this church and others like it in the district. By the 1980s, the services had stopped. The church was maintained by the few remaining families in the district, cleaned and kept locked, and the stonework repaired where the occasional repair was needed. It is still maintained. Someone keeps it. Someone with a connection to the community that built it, or to the families that worshipped in it, continues to make sure the roof does not collapse and the windows are intact and the door can be opened. The church at the end of the road stands in a landscape that has not stopped being beautiful, that continues to be lit by the same morning light, that someone calculated would fall through those carefully placed windows. It is waiting for something that may not come. but it is well kept, which is the most that can be asked of anything that is waiting. Number 55, the fern collector. In the late Victorian period, the collection and pressing of ferns was a widespread pastime among educated women in Britain and its colonies, to an extent that is now difficult to fully appreciate. The fashion for fern collection, called pterodomania by those who observed it with more irony than enthusiasm, produced an enormous quantity of pressed herbarium specimens, albums of dried fronds, and botanical illustrations of fern species in collections that ranged from the casual domestic arrangement to the seriously systematic. In Australia, the fashion found particular traction in the eastern colonies, where the wet forests of the ranges produced an extraordinary diversity of fern species, from the tiny and delicate to the monumental tree ferns that tower over gullies in the wet country of Victoria and New South Wales. A woman named Elizabeth Carrington, who lived in the Dandenong Ranges east of Melbourne in the 1880s and 1890s, took fern collection to a degree of seriousness that went well beyond the fashionable and into the genuinely scientific. She collected and preserved specimens of every fern species she could find in the ranges and in the surrounding lowlands, keeping careful records of where each specimen was collected, at what altitude, in what habitat, at what time of year. She accumulated, over approximately 15 years, a collection of more than 400 specimens representing nearly every fern species then known to occur in Victoria. Her collection was mounted in albums with careful annotations, and when she moved away from the Dandenong Ranges in 1901, she donated the collection to a scientific institution in Melbourne that was building its botanical collection. The collection is in the National Herbarium of Victoria, where it continues to have scientific value. The specimens Elizabeth Carrington pressed in the 1880s and 1890s are reference material for researchers studying the historical distribution of fern species in Victoria, and for taxonomists working on the systematics of Australian ferns. Several of the species she collected are now less common in the Dandenong Ranges than they were when she collected them. Her specimens provide a documented record of their historical presence in locations where they are now absent or severely reduced. Elizabeth Carrington did not have scientific training in the formal sense. She had the education of a middle-class woman of her period and class, broad rather than specialized, and she brought to the fern collection the same kind of organized curiosity that formal training would have refined but did not create. The result is a collection that has scientific value that its creator could not have predicted, and that demonstrates, again, the contribution that systematic amateur observation can make to scientific knowledge. The albums are in the herbarium. The ferns she collected are dry and flat and exactly themselves, preserved across more than a century in the form she pressed them into. Number 56, the slow journey. In 1901, the year of Australian Federation, a man named Henry Bathurst left a property in the far north of Western Australia and walked to Perth. He walked because he did not have money for any other form of transport, and because the journey was one he wanted to make, and because walking was, in his experience, a perfectly adequate means of getting from one place to another if you were not in a hurry. He was not in a hurry. The journey was approximately 2,500 kilometers by the route he took, which was not the most direct route, but was the route that passed through the most country he had not seen. He walked it in 14 months, arriving in Perth in March 1903. Along the way, he worked when work was available, droving and fencing and helping with shearing and doing the variety of manual work that an able-bodied man could find in the pastoral country he passed through. He slept where he could, in shearers' quarters, and in swags on the ground, and occasionally under the accommodation of families who offered it to a traveler on foot. He kept a journal. The journal is not in any archive. It was kept by his family after his death, and was mentioned in a family history compiled in the 1970s by a grandchild who had read it. The grandchild's account of the journal, which is the only extant description of its contents, says that it was a detailed record of the country Bathurst passed through, of the people he met, and of the conditions of the road in different seasons and in different parts of the route. Henry Bathurst arrived in Perth in 1903 and apparently settled there. Whether the federation that he had walked toward was what he expected it to be, whether the new Commonwealth of Australia felt different from the ground than it had from a property in the far north, is not recorded. He had walked 2,500 kilometers to get there. Perhaps the walking was the point. Perhaps the country through which he walked was the thing he had wanted to see, and the arrival was simply the conclusion of the seeing. The journal is somewhere. In a box, perhaps, in a house somewhere in Western Australia, in the keeping of people who may not know what they have. Number 57. The piano in the outback. In a homestead in the far northwest of South Australia, there is a record from the early 20th century of a piano. The piano had been shipped from Adelaide on a wagon train to a pastoral station that was several weeks' journey into the interior. The journey of the piano from Adelaide to its final location was itself a considerable logistical achievement, requiring a specially constructed cradle to protect the instrument from the bumps of the track, and a period of approximately 6 weeks during which the piano made its way into country that did not expect it. The piano arrived intact. This was something of a minor miracle, given the conditions of outback tracks in the period and the vibrations inherent in a 6-week wagon journey. The woman who had arranged for the piano to be brought to the station was the wife of the station manager. She had been a capable amateur pianist before her marriage and before her move to the outback, and she had concluded, after some years on the station without access to music, that the piano was an acceptable use of the money required to bring it. She played the piano in the evenings after the day's work was done in the main room of the homestead. The station workers could hear the piano through the walls of the homestead, sound carrying in the dry air of the inland in a way that it does not in more humid climates. The sound of a piano playing in the outback at night is a specific and unusual sound, one that several of the station workers mentioned in subsequent accounts of their time on the station. The piano remained on the station through several changes of management. When the station eventually changed ownership in the 1940s, the piano was not specifically included in the sale agreement and was left in the homestead. It remained there, played occasionally by whoever happened to have the skill and the inclination, until the homestead was damaged by flooding in the 1960s and was subsequently partially demolished. The piano's fate after the homestead's demolition is not recorded. Pianos are large objects and difficult to move, and the homestead was remote enough that whatever was left in it when the demolition was done was probably left permanently. If the piano is still there, in whatever remains of the homestead structure, it has been sitting in the outback for more than a century. The keys would be unusable, the strings would have corroded and lost their tension. The cabinet might still be standing, but the sound of it, the piano music that the station workers heard through the homestead walls at night, the specific and unexpected sound of a piano in country that had never heard one before, that is gone. It was there, and then it was not, and the night in the outback returned to the sounds it had been making before the piano arrived. Number 58, the mountain that changed its name. In the Geological Survey records of the Northern Territory, there is a mountain, or more accurately, a significant rocky outcrop of the kind that the territory produces in various sizes and configurations across its ancient landscape, that was recorded in the official geographical survey under one name, was subsequently referred to by a different name in an explorer's journal, was mapped under a third name by a later survey expedition, and eventually acquired a fourth name when it was formally gazetted. The mountain is still there. It has always had the same geological composition and the same physical form. It has not moved. But it has been called 4 different things by 4 different sets of people who encountered it at different times. The name under which it was first officially recorded was an anglicized version of the name used by the Aboriginal people of the region, transliterated with varying degrees of accuracy from the original language. This is a common issue in Australian place naming, where the phonology of Aboriginal languages was frequently distorted in the process of being rendered in English letters by people who were not speakers of those languages, and who brought to the transliteration process the phonological assumptions of their own language. The explorer who subsequently referred to the outcrop in his journal used an entirely different name, one that commemorated a patron or a colleague in the fashion of explorers, who distributed the names of significant people in their social networks across the features of the landscapes they traversed. This name did not stick because the explorer's journal did not attract the same attention as other accounts of the region, and the name did not make it into the maps that were in wider circulation. The later survey expedition used a descriptive name, one that referred to a physical feature of the outcrop that was visible from a distance. This name was practical and accurate and appeared on several survey maps. The gazetted name, which is the official name now, was chosen in the process of systematic place name revision that the Northern Territory government undertook in the late 20th century, partly in consultation with Aboriginal communities about the appropriate treatment of place names in their traditional country. The name the mountain currently has is a version of the original Aboriginal name, retransliterated with better linguistic knowledge than was available at the time of the first official recording. It is closer to the original than the first official version was. Whether it is completely accurate is a question that depends on which speakers of the language you consult and on the specific protocols of that language regarding the use of names. The mountain is called what it is called now. The other three names are in the historical records where they were deposited, available to anyone who wants to trace the history of a rocky outcrop in the Northern Territory through the various acts of naming that have been applied to it. Number 59. The beekeeper at the end of the track. In the Grampians region of Western Victoria, in the period between the two world wars, a man named George Sutton kept bees at a location that was accessible from the nearest road by a track of approximately 8 kilometers that was impassable after rain, and that in summer required a specific knowledge of which sections were dry and which sections concealed hidden soft spots that would trap a vehicle. Sutton had chosen this location because it offered what bees require: diverse flowering vegetation, access to water, shelter from wind, and the freedom from human disturbance that allows colonies to develop without the stress of frequent inspection. The Grampians produced an exceptional variety of flowering plants, including many native species whose nectar qualities made for honey of a distinctively complex flavor. Sutton had developed a reputation for this honey among a small but committed clientele in Melbourne, to whom he sent regular consignments. The consignments were transported along the 8-kilometer track to the road by Sutton himself, in a vehicle that had been extensively modified to handle the track's conditions. From the road, the honey went by truck to the railway station and then by train to Melbourne, where it was distributed to the clients who had standing orders. This supply chain, from hives in the Grampians to tables in Melbourne, was maintained by Sutton for approximately 20 years. The logistics were considerable. The quality was consistent. The client stayed. Sutton kept records of his hive management in a series of notebooks that are in the collection of the Museum of Victoria, donated after his death by a nephew who had no use for them, but recognized that someone might. The notebooks are detailed accounts of the management of a professional apiary, recording the state of each colony across seasons, the queen replacement schedule, the honey extraction dates and volumes, the treatment of disease and of swarming behavior. They are also records of the seasons in the Grampians as Sutton experienced them, which is to say as a beekeeper experiences them, through the timing of specific plants flowering and the colony's responses to those flowerings. The notes he made about which plants were blooming in which weeks of which years are incidental to the apiary management, but useful to researchers studying historical flowering phenology in the Grampians. Sutton died in the 1950s. The apiary did not continue without him. The track grew over. The site where the hives had stood is probably indistinguishable now from the surrounding vegetation. But the honey that his bees made from the Grampians flowers was eaten by people in Melbourne who valued it, and the notebooks that record how he managed the making of it are in a museum, and the flowering times of the plants that the bees visited are in those notebooks as incidental observations made by a man who was paying close attention to the world he lived in. Number 60. The Voice on the Wire. The telegraph network that connected Australian settlements across vast distances in the latter half of the 19th century was a technological achievement of significant importance, one that reduced the time required to transmit messages across the continent from weeks to minutes. The line from Adelaide to Darwin, the Overland Telegraph Line, was completed in 1872 and connected Australia to the submarine cable network that linked it to the rest of the world. The operators who worked the telegraph stations along the line, particularly those at the remote stations deep in the interior, developed a culture specific to their circumstances. Isolated at their stations, connected to the network of stations along the line through the dots and dashes of Morse code, they communicated not only the official traffic, the commercial messages and government dispatches that justified their employment, but also unofficial communication, the conversations that people who are isolated naturally want to have when they find a way to have them. The operators along the Overland Telegraph Line talked to each other, not in the approved official communications, but in the intervals between official traffic, in the hours of the night when the line was quiet and the isolation of the Central Australian interior pressed in from all sides. They exchanged information about the conditions at their stations. They relayed news about the surrounding country. They told stories. One operator at a Central Australian station, a man named Clark, whose given name is not preserved in the records with the consistency needed to identify it definitively, was known among the operators of the line for a particular kind of communication. In the quiet hours of the night, Clark would transmit descriptions of what he could see from his station, the sky, the landscape, the wildlife that came to the station's water supply. These descriptions were received by the operators at adjacent stations, who had nothing better to do with their time in those quiet hours than listen. The descriptions were apparently vivid and detailed enough that operators up and down the line came to look forward to them. A note in the correspondence of one Adelaide operator mentions having received, via a chain of relaying through multiple stations, a description of a night sky at the Central Australian station that was the most beautiful account of a sky he had ever read, transmitted in Morse code at 2 in the morning by a man 800 kilometers away. The descriptions themselves are not preserved. They were transmitted, received, perhaps read aloud to a companion at the station, and then gone because the telegraph did not produce a physical record of informal traffic in the way that letters produce a physical record of correspondence. Clark's name is in the station staffing records. His descriptions are in the recollection of the man in Adelaide who mentioned them in a letter that has survived. The sky over the Central Australian interior that he described at 2 in the morning is still there, still producing the same extraordinary displays of stars that moved him enough to transmit them in Morse code to whoever was listening. The descriptions are gone. The sky remains. Number 61, the flood that left a mark. On the wall of a building in a town on the Darling River in western New South Wales, there is a series of marks that record the flood levels reached by the river in various years. The practice of marking flood levels on a fixed structure is common in river towns around the world, a practical form of institutional memory that tells subsequent generations how high the water has been. The marks on this wall go back to 1864, when a flood of considerable size came down the Darling and left the river at a level that the people of the town thought worth recording. Subsequent floods were recorded in subsequent years, each mark showing the high water line of a particular flood event and the year in which it occurred. The series of marks is a physical record of approximately 160 years of flood events on a section of the Darling River. It shows the variability of the river's behavior, the years of extreme flooding, and the years of normal flooding, and the years when the flood was moderate enough that it was recorded, but did not significantly exceed previous marks. The series also shows gaps. There are years in which floods occurred that are not marked, either because the flood did not reach a level worth recording, or because the specific institutional attention required to make the mark was not organized in those years. The gaps in the record are information too, information about the years in which the flood was modest or the town's attention was elsewhere. The building on whose wall the marks are recorded has been repaired and modified over the years, but the wall that carries the flood marks has been preserved as a practical document of the river's history and as a piece of local heritage. The highest mark on the wall is from a flood that occurred in the 19th century. Subsequent floods have reached close to that level, but have not exceeded it in the available record. Whether they will in the future is a question that the marks themselves cannot answer. They record the past. The future will make its own marks or not. Number 62. The schoolmaster's list. In a one-room schoolhouse in the wheat belt of Western Australia in the 1920s and 1930s, a schoolmaster named Edwin Cross maintained, alongside the official school rolls and attendance records, a personal list of the children he taught and what became of them. The official records documented the attendance and the academic performance of the children while they were in his school. Cross's personal list documented what happened after they left. He tracked his former students through the means available to him, through the occasional letter from a former student or their family, through encounters in the towns he visited during school holidays, through the accounts of people in the district who knew where particular families had gone when they left the wheat belt. He kept the list in a notebook that he updated when he had information to add. The list, which covers approximately 180 students across the period of his teaching career at the school, is in the Batty Library of Western Australian History. It is an unusual document, an unofficial longitudinal tracking of a rural schoolchildren's cohort across the difficult decades of the Depression and the Second World War. What the list shows is the dispersion that characterized the wheat belt communities in those decades. The children of farming families spread across Western Australia and across Australia more broadly, following work and opportunity and marriage to the cities and towns and distant farming districts. Some remained in the wheat belt, some went to Perth, some went to other states. Some went to the war and some of them did not come back. Cross noted deaths. He noted marriages. He noted the occupations that his former students had found. He noted occasionally something that a former student had said in a letter that seemed to him worth preserving alongside the practical biographical information. One note, beside the name of a girl who had left the school at 14 to help on her family's farm during the Depression, reads, "She told me she still reads every book she can find. This seems right. The schoolmaster's list is a document of the belief that the lives of children from a one-room schoolhouse in the wheat belt are worth tracking, worth knowing about, worth recording. The children themselves mostly did not know they were on the list, but they were on it. They were tracked with care by a man who believed that teaching people to read and write was the beginning of something that deserved to be followed. Number 63, the last night at the station. In the records of the Overland Telegraph Line, there is a brief account of the last night of operation of one of the remote stations along the line, written by the operator who was responsible for closing it when the line was rerouted and the station made redundant. The operator, whose name appears in the records, had worked the station for several years. He was not a sentimental man, or did not present himself as such in the official correspondence that makes up most of the documentary record of his career. He was practical, accurate, reliable in his work, qualities that the telegraph service valued and that the isolation of a Central Australian station required. On the last night of the station's operation, before he sealed the equipment and prepared for the journey back to the nearest town, he sat at the telegraph key and sent a message along the line. The message was not an official communication. It was, in the account he wrote afterward, a kind of farewell. He tapped out a description of the station as it was on that last night. The equipment he was about to seal, the sky outside the window, the silence that was already beginning to feel different from the usual silence of the station, now that he knew it was his last night in it. He did not know if anyone received the message. The stations along the line were not all staffed at the late hour when he sent it, and the relay system meant that messages moved in specific patterns that did not guarantee delivery to all stations. He sealed the equipment in the morning and rode out. The station building was left standing. Buildings in the Central Australian interior last a long time when they are not actively demolished, because the aridity that makes the country difficult for people is also the aridity that preserves structures. The station building remained for several decades, visited occasionally by travelers who knew the track that passed near it, before it was finally reduced to rubble by time and the occasional collector of old materials. The message the operator sent on his last night is not preserved. Messages that were not official communications were not retained in the telegraph system's records. It exists only in the operator's account of having sent it, which is itself in a file that has been consulted by perhaps 3 researchers in the century since it was written. He sent a message into the night. It may have been received, it may not have been. Either way, he sent it because there was something he wanted to say about the place he was leaving, and the telegraph was there. Number 64, the silence of the interior. There is a quality of silence in the interior of Australia that is unlike the silence of other places. In a city, silence is the absence of the specific sounds that define the city. Remove the traffic and the voices and the machinery, and what is left is not silence, but the background hum of infrastructure, the vibration of civilization made minimal. In a forest, silence is the absence of human sound against a background of biological activity. Birds and insects and wind and leaves and the movements of animals produce a continuous texture of sound that is what silence sounds like in a place full of life. In the interior of Australia, in the truly remote places, in the country between the water sources where no human presence has been sustained for extended periods, there is a silence that is genuinely different. It is not the absence of city noise. It is not the background of biological activity. It is a silence that is itself a presence, a quality of the place that people who have experienced it describe with a consistent vocabulary of expansion, of the self becoming larger in the absence of sound, of the boundary between oneself and the surrounding country becoming less distinct. This silence has been described by explorers and by Aboriginal people and by the occasional traveler who has reached the places where it exists, and the descriptions have a consistent quality that suggests they are attempts to describe the same experience. It is a silence that the history of Australia has mostly happened around at the edges of, in the places where water and food and company made settlement possible. The history of Australia is largely a history of the periphery. The history of the interior is largely a history of what did not persist, what could not be sustained, what passed through, and left traces that the silence absorbed. The silence is still there. It is not threatened in the way that other natural features are threatened, because the conditions that produce it, the absence of water and human settlement, and the biological density that water produces, are not going to change in any foreseeable future. The interior is still the interior. The silence is still the silence. All the history we have been talking about tonight happened around its edges. And that is where we will rest now, the towns that voted to disappear, the lighthouse keepers who kept the light, the rivers that changed their minds, and the women who kept running the stations, and the children who named the water holes, the piano in the outback, and the beekeeper at the end of the track, and the schoolmaster who kept a list, the Aboriginal cricketers who sailed to England, and the camel drivers who mapped the routes that no one else knew, and the telegraph operator who sent a farewell message into the dark. All of it is Australia. All of it is the country's strange, enormous, barely told story. You do not have to remember any of it. It will be here tomorrow, in the archives and the collections, and the long memories of the places where it happened. The ground remembers, the rivers remember, even the ones that have changed their course. The islands remember, and the salt lakes, and the reefs, and the silence of the interior. You can let go of all of it now. Let the voices settle. Let the distances open up. Let the stillness of the Australian night come in. The country is still out there, older than any history that has been recorded about it. Patient in the way that very old things are patient, not waiting for anything in particular, simply being what it is. And you can rest in that. You can let the history drift away, down the Murray, out past the reef, into the deep water, into the silence of the interior. Everything that needed to be said has been said. Good night. Number 65. The settlement that existed on paper. In the colonial land records of South Australia, there is a settlement that was granted official status, given a name, allocated a post office designation, and provided with a local government representative before a single permanent building had been constructed within its declared boundaries. The settlement existed in 889 entirely on paper. The land in question had been surveyed, the lots had been drawn up, and were available for purchase. The colonial government, in its administrative optimism, had designated the area as a township and begun treating it as such in its records. No one bought the lots, no one built the buildings. No one moved to the township that existed on the government's books, but nowhere else. The reasons for this were geological. A geological survey conducted shortly after the township was gazetted, a survey that should perhaps have been conducted before the gazettal, revealed that the water supply in the area was severely limited. The aquifer that had been expected to underlie the surveyed land did not exist in the form anticipated. Bore drilling produced insufficient water for a sustainable settlement. Without water, no one came. The township continued to be listed in the colonial administrative records for several years. It appeared in the government almanac. It had a post office designation, though no post office was ever built. It had a local government representation that was notional, handled by the nearest settled areas council. Eventually, the colonial administration quietly removed the township from its records, an administrative act that attracted no attention because there was no community in the township to notice or object to the removal. The surveyed lots reverted to their previous classification. The name chosen for the township disappeared from the maps. The post office designation was cancelled. The settlement that had existed only on paper ceased to exist even there. The land continues to be dry. The aquifer that was expected continues not to exist. The paper on which the settlement was recorded is in the state records of South Australia, a document of administrative optimism confronted by geological reality. Number 66. The fossicker. In the history of Australian gold mining, the fossicker occupies a particular and somewhat romantic position. The fossicker is the individual small-scale miner who works alone or in a very small group, looking for the gold that the larger operations have missed, sifting through tailings and searching creek banks and picking at quartz formations with hand tools. Fossicking has continued in Australia long after the industrial gold mining industry consolidated and moved to the deep mechanized operations that characterize the major goldfields today. In the 20th century, the fossicker persisted in the goldfields of Victoria, New South Wales, Western Australia, and Queensland, a figure who represented a kind of continuity with the gold rush era that most other forms of gold mining had abandoned. One fossicker whose activities are documented in some detail in the records of the local historical society of a goldfields town in Victoria is a man named Patrick Dwyer, who fossicked in the area around the town from approximately 1920 to 1960, a period of 40 years. Dwyer had come to the goldfields as a young man during a brief gold rush in the region and had stayed after the rush subsided, finding in the fossicking life a kind of freedom and independence that he preferred to the alternatives. He lived modestly. He found enough gold, across 40 years, to sustain himself without resorting to other work. In good years, he found more than he needed and used the surplus to replace worn equipment and to maintain the small hut where he lived on the edge of the goldfields. In lean years, he found less, but still enough. He knew the geology of the area around the town in a way that 40 years of systematic exploration of every creek and gully and exposed formation produces. This knowledge was experiential and holistic, the kind of knowledge that cannot be fully expressed in the technical vocabulary of geology, but that is expressed in the ability to look at a landscape and sense where the gold might be. He did not share this knowledge systematically, though he occasionally advised newcomers to the fossicking area when they asked, and he thought their intentions were genuine. He was not secretive about his methods, but he was not particularly loquacious about them either. When Dwyer died in 1960, his hut was cleared by the local council. Some of his notebooks were found in the hut and were donated to the Historical Society, where they remain. The notebooks are not extensive, brief notes about specific locations and what he had found there, more aid memoir than systematic record. The knowledge of the landscape that Dwyer carried in his head for 40 years is not in the notebooks. It is not anywhere. It died with him, as most accumulated experiential knowledge dies, absorbed back into the landscape it was extracted from. The goldfields around the town continued to yield fossicker's occasional finds. The gold that Dwyer did not find is still there. Number 67, the town with the widest main street in Australia. In a small town in Western Queensland, the main street is wide. Not wide in the way that main streets are sometimes wide. Wide in the way that makes first-time visitors stop and look from one side to the other and try to understand what they're seeing. The width of this main street is the result of a practical decision made in the 1880s by the surveyor who laid out the town. The decision was based on the operational requirements of the droving industry, which in the 1880s was the primary economic activity that the town was established to service. Mobs of cattle being driven from the properties of the western interior to the railhead pass through the town. A mob of cattle is a large object. It requires space. The road through a town is a potential bottleneck in the movement of cattle, a location where the mob must be concentrated and navigated through what would otherwise be a series of obstacles. The surveyor, who was a practical man with direct experience of the droving industry, solved the bottleneck problem by making the main street of the town wide enough to accommodate a substantial mob of cattle moving through it without difficulty. The buildings on either side of the street were set back far enough that the cattle in the middle of the street would not be pressed against walls or fences or the various hazards of a built environment. The main street was surveyed to a width that gave the drovers room. The town was built around the main street. The droving industry eventually gave way to road trains and to other forms of cattle transport that did not require mobs of cattle to walk through towns. The wide main street no longer has its original purpose. It is now simply a very wide main street, used for parking and the occasional local event. But it is a historical record of a decision made by a practical man who knew what the town needed to do and built it to do that thing efficiently. The width of the street is a document of the droving industry, as clear and durable as any written account. First-time visitors still stop and look from one side to the other. Number 68, the nurse who rode. In the history of the Royal Flying Doctor Service of Australia, much has been written about the pilots and the aircraft and the distances they covered and the emergencies they responded to. Less has been written about the nurses and other medical staff who worked the ground side of the outback medical service. The people who, before the flying doctor could reach a patient, were sometimes the only medical presence available. One of these nurses, a woman named Alice Pemberton, served in a district of northwestern New South Wales in the 1930s and 1940s and covered her district on horseback because the roads in her area were not consistently passable, and the distances involved were such that waiting for a vehicle was not always an option. Pemberton had been a hospital nurse in Sydney before accepting the outback posting, and the adjustment from hospital nursing to outback nursing was, by her own account, substantial. Hospital nursing is conducted in an environment of abundant equipment and institutional support. Outback nursing, in a remote district in the 1930s, was conducted with what you could carry on a horse and what you could improvise on arrival. She developed the skills that the environment required, not as replacements for her formal training, but as extensions of it. She learned to recognize the early signs of conditions that in a hospital she might not have had to recognize at all because they would have been referred immediately to a physician. She learned to manage situations with the resources she had rather than waiting for resources she did not have. Her case notes, which she maintained throughout her years in the district, and which are in the collections of the Royal Flying Doctor Service, are records of outback medicine in the Depression era. They describe clinical situations managed under resource constraints that most contemporary medical practitioners would find extraordinary. They also describe the country she rode through, which she observed with the attention of someone who spent a great deal of time in it and who found in it something that kept her there for 15 years, long past the point at which she could have returned to city nursing if she had wanted to. She retired from the district in 1951 and returned to Sydney, where she spent her remaining years. She did not ride horses in Sydney. She lived quietly and died in 1974. The country she rode through for 15 years is the same country, more or less, although the roads that now cross it are better than anything that existed when she was covering it on horseback. The patients she treated are mostly gone. The case notes are in the archive. And somewhere in the archive, between the clinical observations, she described what the country looked like at dawn when she was riding toward a patient who needed her, and what it smelled like and what it sounded like, and how the light came up over the hills to the east and made the country something that she was glad to be in. Number 69, the Pearl Diver's Song. On the pearl shell luggers that worked the waters off the northwestern coast of Australia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The labor was done by divers who went down on the end of a weighted line to the seafloor, picked up the pearl shell that the pearling industry needed, and were hauled back up. The divers who did this work came from various places. Many were from what is now Malaysia and Indonesia, recruited by the pearling industry because the diving experience and the physical characteristics the work required were well developed in those maritime communities. Aboriginal Australians also worked the luggers in various capacities. Japanese divers became a significant part of the workforce in the early 20th century. The luggers were working boats with small crews living in close quarters for extended periods at sea. The diversity of the crews, drawn from different cultural and linguistic backgrounds, produced communities of practical communication and cultural exchange that were unusual in the racial context of colonial Australia. Music was part of that community life. The different groups on the luggers brought their own musical traditions, and these traditions mixed in the confined space of a working boat in the ways that music mixes when people spend time together and have something they want to express. Songs developed on the luggers that were not quite any of the traditions that had been brought aboard. They were songs that had absorbed elements of Malay and Japanese and Aboriginal musical traditions, and that existed in the specific cultural space that the pearling industry created. These songs were not recorded in the period when they were current. They were working songs, sung by working people in circumstances that did not attract the attention of those who might have made recordings. By the time folklorists and anthropologists became interested in the musical traditions of the pearling industry, most of the people who had sung the songs were gone. A small number of songs were collected in the mid-20th century from former lugger workers who could still remember them. These are in the collection of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. They represent a fragment of what must have been a richer tradition, the preservation of a few threads from a fabric that is mostly unraveled. The songs that are lost are, by definition, unknowable. We know they existed because the people who made them were there, and people in close quarters for extended periods make songs. We do not know what they sounded like or what they were about, except in the most general terms. The sea that the luggers worked is still there. The pearl shell beds have been depleted by the industry that worked them. The towns that the pearling industry built are still there, smaller and quieter now. The songs are mostly gone. Number 70, the map in the sand. In the accounts of early European explorers who travelled through the central and western parts of Australia with Aboriginal guides, there are references to a practice of mapping that is different from the cartographic conventions of European geography. Aboriginal guides, when they needed to communicate geographical information to European explorers, sometimes drew maps in the sand or in the earth, using a stick or a finger to trace routes and mark features and indicate distances and directions. These sand maps were temporary, erased by wind or rain or the feet of animals, and they do not survive in any physical form. They are described in the journals of the explorers who saw them. And those descriptions provide an interesting window into a geographic knowledge tradition that was organized differently from European cartography. European maps represent geography from an imaginary aerial perspective, a bird's-eye view that was achieved by the techniques of survey and triangulation. They represent distance proportionally, with a consistent scale that allows calculation of the real-world distances between mapped features. The sand maps, as described by the explorers who saw them, did not necessarily work this way. They appear to have represented geography experientially, from the perspective of a person moving through the landscape, with distances represented not proportionally but functionally, with the time and difficulty of travel as the relevant measure rather than measured distance. A route that covered great physical distance, but that was relatively easy, with reliable water and shade and gradual terrain, might be represented as shorter in the sand map than a route that covered less physical distance but was harder, with poor water and exposed country and difficult terrain. The map represented the experience of traveling the country, not the geometry of it. This is not an inferior mapping convention. It is a different one, adapted to the needs of people who were navigating through a landscape on foot and who needed to know how long a journey would take and how difficult it would be, not the Euclidean distance between 2 points. The sand maps could not be preserved. They were not made to be preserved. They were made to communicate a specific piece of information at a specific moment, and when the communication was done, the map was no longer needed. The knowledge that the sand maps communicated is in the landscape, encoded in the routes and the water sources and the features that the maps indicated. Some of that knowledge has been recorded in other forms, in the accounts of explorers and in the reports of surveyors and in the ethnographic records of anthropologists. Some of it has been maintained in the oral traditions of the communities that originated it. Some of it is gone, erased as completely as the maps that expressed it, the sand smoothed over by the wind that has been moving across the central Australian landscape for a very long time. Number 71. The year it did not rain. There have been many drought years in Australian history. The continent's climate is characterized by variability, and extended periods of below-average rainfall are part of its natural rhythm. The droughts that have affected Australian agriculture and pastoralism across the colonial and post-colonial period are numerous and are documented in varying degrees of detail in the records of the agricultural industry, the Meteorological Service, and the communities that experienced them. One particular drought in the 1890s, which affected a broad area of eastern Australia over several consecutive years, left a record in the documentary History of Rural Communities that is unusually detailed because it coincided with the development of local newspapers in many of the affected towns. These newspapers, small operations with limited resources, publish the news of their communities with the directness that small local papers produce when the community is small enough that the readers know the people the news is about. The drought years of the 1890s produced a sustained narrative in these papers, a record of the community's experience of extended rainfall failure that is more intimate and more granular than the official meteorological records. The newspapers publish rainfall tallies each week, the actual rainfall against the average, a running record of the deficit that the drought was producing. They published accounts of the state of the pasture and the state of the water supplies. They published the news of stock losses and station abandonments and the departures of families who had decided that they could not continue in a country that was not producing enough water to sustain them. They also published the community's responses to the drought, the church services held to pray for rain, the public meetings where the implications of the drought for the district's future were discussed, the practical measures being taken to conserve water and to keep livestock alive. One newspaper in a Western Queensland town published, in the third consecutive year of drought, a single line in its rainfall column that read, "Nothing again. It has not rained since we last had reason to write a different number here." The line was not editorializing, it was accurate. It was the kind of accuracy that a small community paper achieves when the community is experiencing something together, and the paper is simply recording what everyone already knows. The rain eventually came. It always comes in Australia because the climate is variable and drought is one end of a spectrum that also has the other end. The communities that survived the 1890s drought rebuilt in the wet years that followed. Some did not survive and were not rebuilt. The newspapers that recorded the drought are in various collections, microfilmed and digitized to varying degrees. The record of communities trying to understand and communicate an experience that was testing them severely. The single line about nothing again is still there, in the digitized record of a small Western Queensland newspaper, a record of the third year of a drought that eventually ended. Number 72, the night watchman, in the records of a gold mining company in the Kalgoorlie region of Western Australia. There is a reference to a night watchman who was employed to guard the mine's surface infrastructure through the hours between the end of the evening shift and the beginning of the morning shift. The night watchman's duties were straightforward and are described in his employment conditions. He was to patrol the surface facilities at specified intervals, check that the equipment was secure, ensure that no unauthorized persons were accessing the mine site, and report any unusual occurrences. What is interesting about this particular night watchman is not his duties, but what he did during the intervals between his patrols. He wrote poetry. This was not known to his employers until his retirement, when he presented the manager of the mining company with a small, self-published collection of poems that he had written over the course of his 12 years of night watching. The collection was printed in an edition of 50 copies, which he distributed to people he knew and which have subsequently dispersed through the various channels by which small private publications disperse. The poems were about the goldfields at night. They were about the specific quality of the Kalgoorlie landscape under different conditions of moonlight and cloud cover, and different intensities of the starfields that were visible from the mine site in the pre-dawn hours. They were about the sounds of the mine at night, the settling of the machinery between shifts, the sounds of the surrounding scrub, the distant sounds of the town. They were not sophisticated poems in the technical sense. The night watchman had not had a literary education, and his meters were sometimes approximate, and his rhymes sometimes strained. But they were honest poems, the work of someone who was paying close attention to his environment during the quiet hours of 12 years of night watching, and who felt the need to find a language for what he was observing. A single copy of the collection is in the Goldfields Library in Kalgoorlie, donated by a member of the public who had acquired it from somewhere. Whether any other copies survive in accessible locations is not known. The night watchman retired in the early 1950s and moved to Perth. Whether he continued writing poetry in Perth is not recorded. The Kalgoorlie landscape that he wrote about is still there, still producing the same starfields on clear nights, still settling into the silence between the shifts. His name was on the collection. In the interest of the quiet this story is being told in, we will not say it here. But it is in the Goldfields Library, on the cover of a small book of poems written during 12 years of night watches. Number 73. The Bones of the Lake. In Lake Mungo, a dry lake in the Willandra Lakes region of western New South Wales, the remains of ancient human burials have been found that are among the oldest documented human burials anywhere in the world. The most significant of these finds, known as Mungo Lady and Mungo Man, are dated to approximately 40,000 years ago and 42,000 years ago respectively. They were found in the 1960s and 1970s by researchers from the Australian National University, eroding out of the lake's shoreline sediments that had been gradually exposing them as the wind moved the surface over thousands of years. The finds were of enormous scientific significance. They extended the documented timeline of human presence in Australia and demonstrated that culturally significant mortuary practices, including the use of ochre in burial, were practiced by people in Australia at a time that challenged many assumptions about the development of human culture globally. They were also the remains of people, real individuals who had lived and died on the shores of a lake that was then full of water and abundant with life, in a landscape that bore little resemblance to the dry scrubland that now surrounds the dry lake bed. The descendants of those people, the traditional owners of the Willandra Lakes region, were not initially consulted in the research that was conducted on the remains. The scientific process of the time did not require such consultation. The remains were studied, described, and held by institutions according to the practices of archaeological research. The subsequent decades saw a long and sometimes difficult negotiation between the scientific institutions that held the remains and the three traditional owner groups of the Willandra Lakes region. This negotiation eventually resulted in the return of the remains to the traditional owners, who hold them now in a keeping place on their country. The scientific data derived from the research remains available in the published literature. The remains themselves are back where they belong, held by the community descended from the people to whom they belonged. The lake bed where they were found is still there, the sediment still gradually eroding, the wind still moving across the surface. Occasionally, erosion exposes further evidence of the ancient life of the lake. These discoveries are managed in partnership with the traditional owners under protocols that have been developed over the years since the initial finds. 42,000 years ago, a man lived and died beside a lake that was full of water and a green landscape. His bones lay in the earth as the water receded, and the lake dried and the sediments accumulated, and the centuries passed. They were there when the first Europeans arrived in Australia. They were there for another century and a half before the wind brought them close enough to the surface to be found. They are home now. Number 74. The cook who fed the drovers. On the great stock routes of Australia, the overland routes along which cattle and sheep were moved from the stations of the interior to the coastal markets and the processing facilities, the cook who travelled with the droving team was a figure of considerable importance. The droving cook was responsible for feeding a team of men who were doing hard physical work in demanding conditions over journeys of weeks or months. The rations available were limited. The cooking equipment was minimal, typically a camp oven and a fire, and whatever could be carried on the cook's wagon. The conditions under which meals were prepared range from pleasant to extremely difficult, depending on the weather and the state of the route and the distance from the last resupply point. Within these constraints, the droving cook's skill determined the quality of the team's experience in a way that was not trivial. A team that was well fed, that could look forward to a good meal at the end of a long day, was a team in better spirits than one that ate poorly. The cook's contribution to the droving operation was not only nutritional, but morale sustaining. One cook who is documented in the accounts of a Queensland droving company in the 1890s and 1900s was known among the drovers of the region for a specific skill. She, which was unusual, most droving cooks in this period were men, could produce a reliable damper in conditions that defeated most camp cooks. Damper, the simple camp bread made from flour and water and baked in a camp oven, is basic food, but it requires a specific management of fire and timing that the varied conditions of the stock route complicated. Her damper was consistent. Drovers who had worked with other cooks in conditions where damper was an uncertain outcome of uncertain effort described with some feeling the experience of traveling with a cook whose damper arrived reliably, well risen and cooked through and warm every time it was needed. She is not named in the droving company records in a way that is completely reliable. The accounts of drovers who worked with her refer to her by a common name that may or may not be her actual name. She may have worked for the company for several years or for a shorter period. The records are not specific. She knew how to make damper in a camp oven in the wind and the rain and the heat and the dust of the Queensland stock routes, and the drovers who ate it remembered it. That is the record of her. It is a record that she would probably have found sufficient. Number 75, the closing. We have been traveling together for a long time tonight, through Western Queensland and the Annapolis of Australian history, through the Bass Strait and the Darling and the Murray, through the goldfields and the wheat belt and the Central Australian interior, through the cattle stations and the lighthouses and the telegraph lines and the one-room schoolhouses, through the lives of people who did not think of themselves as historical figures, who simply did the work that was in front of them and lived the lives that were available to them in the specific places and times they inhabited. The woman who ran the station for 23 years, the dentist who walked to his patients, the night watchman who wrote poems, the schoolmaster who kept his list, the cook who made reliable damper, the men and women and children who named waterholes and kept clocks running and kept libraries floating and kept languages alive. All of this is Australia. All of it happened here, on this old continent, in country that has been inhabited for longer than almost anywhere else on Earth, by people who adapted to it and learned it and left their marks in it in ways that the official history does not always record. The history of Australia is the history you can read in books, and the history that is in the archives, and the history that is in the memories of communities, and the history that is in the land itself, in the routes that were walked, and the waterholes that were used, and the songs that were sung, and the languages that were kept alive. It is a long history. Most of it has not been written down. Most of what has been written down has not been read. You have been listening tonight to a small part of it. A collection of quiet stories, told slowly, the way old stories should be told. You do not need to carry any of it with you. It will keep where it is, in the archives and the collections and the places where it happened, waiting for the next person who wants to spend some time with it. The country is still out there. The night sky over the outback is still as clear as it was when Father Doyle pointed his telescope at it, as clear as it was when the telegraph operator described it in Morse code at 2 a.m, as clear as it was 10,000 years ago, when people sat beside waterholes and looked up at the same stars with the same human capacity for wonder. The interior is still silent. The Murray is still running, more slowly than it used to, but running. The reef is still building its coral. The rain comes and goes, as it always has, droughts and floods. The rhythm of a continent that operates on its own scale and in its own time. Everything that needed to be said has been said. The voices are settling now. The distances are opening. The history is drifting back to where it lives, in the country it happened in. You are somewhere warm, somewhere quiet, somewhere that the history of Australia is a very long way away. Let the stories go, let them drift, let the silence of the Australian interior come in at the edges. The real silence, the kind that expands. You are resting now. The country is as it is. The night is long. Sleep well. A few more things before the silence. The painter of the Flinders. Hans Heisen, the South Australian painter who spent decades painting the gum trees in the hills and the light of the Flinders Ranges in the Adelaide Hills, is well documented in Australian art history. But there is a less documented painter who worked in the Flinders Ranges at approximately the same time, a woman named Dorothy Threlfall, who lived in the ranges for several years in the 1920s, and who painted the landscape with a directness and an economy of means that some subsequent viewers have found more contemporary in feeling than the more celebrated work of her male contemporaries. Threlfall's paintings are scattered. A small number are in regional collections. Some are in private hands, some are simply gone, lost through the various means by which art gets lost, damaged by damp, destroyed in moves, sold and resold until the trail of ownership becomes impossible to follow. She lived in the Flinders Ranges for several years, and then she left and did not return. And the paintings she made there are the record of those years, available to the extent that they can be found. The ranges she painted are still there, still producing the same quality of light that she tried to capture. The dry clarity of the inland Australian light that has a particular quality in the Flinders, where the quartzite hills reflected in ways that painters have been trying to understand since the first of them arrived in the country. The beekeeper's last hive. There was a beekeeper in the Dandenong Ranges east of Melbourne who, in the 1950s, maintained a single hive long after the rest of her apiary had been given up. She had been a beekeeper for 30 years. She had maintained, at the height of her operation, 40 hives. But as she aged and the physical demands of maintaining a substantial apiary became difficult to meet, she reduced the number of hives one by one until there was only one left. The last hive she maintained until she could no longer physically get to it, which was in her late 80s. She had kept it for the bees rather than for the honey, which she could no longer harvest in quantity. The hive was positioned near a stand of native flowering shrubs that the bees worked enthusiastically in spring and summer, and she could see it from the window of her house, and watching the bees come and go from it was something she found satisfying in a way she had trouble explaining to people who had not kept bees. When she could no longer maintain it, the hive eventually collapsed. Hives without management do not usually persist indefinitely in the conditions of the Dandenong Ranges. The colony died or swarmed and established elsewhere. The hive box remained for a while and then was removed. She died not long afterward. She had watched bees for 30 years, and the last thing she watched from her window that gave her the specific satisfaction she associated with bees was the single hive in the stand of flowering shrubs. The shrubs are still there. They flower each spring, and the bees, other bees with no connection to hers, come to work them. The track through the saltbush. There is a track through a stretch of saltbush country in western New South Wales that appears on no map, and that has been used for long enough that the saltbush has grown up on either side of it in a way that marks its passage through the landscape even when the track itself is not visible on the surface. The track was made by someone who passed through this country regularly enough that their passage created a path, possibly a droving track from the pastoral era, possibly an older Aboriginal route, possibly both, the later use following the earlier. The way that tracks in Australia often work, with each user following the path that someone else made first. The track goes from a waterhole to another waterhole. This is the logic of tracks in dry country. You go from water to water, and the straightest way from water to water becomes the track that everyone uses because everyone needs the water. The saltbush on either side of the track is older than the track itself. It was growing in the plain before anyone made the track through it. The track is simply the place where the saltbush has learned not to grow because feet and hooves and wheels have compressed the ground. In 50 years of no use, the saltbush would probably close back over the track. But there are still people who use it occasionally, people who know it is there and who need to get from one waterhole to the other. The track stays open, used just enough to keep the saltbush from closing over it. That is enough. And now, the stories are quiet. The voices have drifted away, across the Flinders Ranges and the Saltbush Plains, and the deep water of the Bass Strait and the silence of the central Australian interior. The country is, as it has always been, patient and old and indifferent in the way that very old things are indifferent, not unkind, simply vast, simply itself. You are still. The breath is slow, the warmth is around you. The long history of Australia is somewhere far away, in the archives and the collections and the land where it happened. You're here, the quiet is here, let it come in. Sleep. One more thing, before sleep. The quiet of a small town on a Sunday. There are towns across Australia, in the tablelands and the wheat belts and the pastoral country, where Sunday mornings still have a quality that is different from the rest of the week. Not because of religion, or not only because of religion, but because the rhythm of the working week pauses, and the town pauses with it, And the particular kind of quiet that this pause produces is something that you can feel if you're in it. The birds are louder on Sunday mornings in small Australian towns, not because there are more of them, but because the human noise that competes with them is less. The magpies in the big gum on the edge of town sound closer than they do on weekdays. The sound of someone's screen door carries further than it would on a Tuesday. This quiet has been a feature of Australian country towns for as long as there have been Australian country towns. The settlers who built those towns brought with them the tradition of the Sunday pause. And even as the religious dimension of that tradition has diminished, the pause itself has persisted, because communities that work hard together need a rhythm, and the pause is part of the rhythm. The people who grew up in small Australian towns and then moved to cities often say, when they think about their childhoods, that one of the things they remember is the Sunday morning quiet. Not as the dominant memory, but as a texture of the place, a quality of the air on those mornings. That quiet is still there in the towns that are still there. It is not a historical artifact. It is a living feature of those places, the same pause that has been there since the town was young, the same birds in the same trees making the same sounds in the reduced competition of Sunday morning. You can let that quiet be the last thing tonight, not the archived quiet of a document in a library. The real quiet, the living quiet of a small town somewhere in Australia on a Sunday morning. The magpies calling in the gum trees, the screen door closing somewhere, the day not yet begun. Let it come in, let it be around you, let it be enough. Good night. The last entry. There is a kind of history that is not written in documents or preserved in archives or taught in schools. It is the history that lives in the texture of places, in the worn stone of a step that many feet have crossed, in the smooth patch on a timber railing where hands have rested for decades, in the angle of a track through the scrub that tells you, if you know how to read it, that this is not a new track, but an old one, worn into the ground by accumulated use over a period of time longer than any particular user would have been there. This kind of history is everywhere in Australia, overlaid by the more recent history of European settlement, visible under it to those who look, present in the landscape in the way that old things are present, quietly, persistently, available to be noticed rather than demanding to be seen. The towns we have talked about tonight, and the people we have talked about tonight, and the rivers and the lakes and the routes and the waterholes, they are all part of this landscape history. They are places where people were, where things happened, where the specific combination of human need and human ingenuity and human persistence and human failure that constitutes history expressed itself in ways that leave traces. The traces are still there. They will be there tomorrow. They have survived everything that the Australian landscape and the Australian climate have put them through. And they will continue to survive because old things in this ancient country have learned how to persist. You do not need to remember any of this. The history does not need your memory to persist. It has its own persistence in the archives and the collections and the land and the communities that carry it. You have heard these stories. That is enough. They have passed through you on their way to wherever stories go when they have been told. Let them go. The night is long and the country is wide and the silence is deep and the warmth is here. Sleep now, everything is still. And if the morning comes and some small piece of tonight has stayed with you, some image of a lighthouse keeper writing in his log, some sound of a piano playing in the outback dark, some sense of the enormous quiet of the Australian interior, that is a good thing to carry. But if nothing stays, that is also right. You were here, the stories were here, the night held them. That is enough. That has always been enough. Rest, the stockman's fire. In the long nights of the outback, when the work of the day was done and the horses were hobbled and the cattle were settled, the stockmen who worked the great runs of inland Australia built their fires small and sat close to them. The small fire is practical. It uses less wood, which matters in country where wood is sometimes scarce. It produces less smoke, which matters when the wind changes. It is easier to manage and easier to let die when sleep comes. The small fire is the fire of experience, the fire of people who have learned that more is not always better, and that enough is usually sufficient. Around these small fires, across the long years of the pastoral industry, stories move between people who were sharing a camp for a night or a week or a season. Stories about the country and the animals and the routes and the people who had come before. Stories that were partly practical, information about water and feed, and the behavior of stock in particular conditions. And partly something else, the telling that people do when they are together in the dark and the fire is small, and the country beyond it is enormous. Most of these stories were never written down. They were told and heard and carried forward in memory. Some were about real things that happened in specific places. Some carried true information about the country and how to be in it. Both kinds served the same purpose, which was to pass knowledge forward. The fires are still built. The stories still move. The country has always been enormous. Sleep now?